Something doesn't add up here, and it's been bugging me for weeks. How did Native American tribes survive in places where even modern technology fails? In this video, I'm sharing the unbelievable truth about these ancient survival masters that will blow your mind. What you're about to discover will literally change how you see human potential forever. This journey into their secret world starts now. But before we dive in, make sure to like this video, subscribe for more mind-blowing history, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Where the glaciers meet the sea, the land breathes in silence and speaks in storms. In the far reaches of southeastern Alaska, where jagged fjords cut deep into the earth and mountains rise like the ribs of the world itself, there is a place where water, stone, and sky have conspired for centuries. Here, cloaked beneath ever-falling mist and the ancient watch of spruce and cedar, lies the homeland of the Chilkat Tlingit people. To the outsider, it may seem remote, cold, unforgiving. But for those who have lived here for generations, whose stories run like veins through the land, this is not wilderness. It is kin. The Chilkat River, braided and glacial fed, flows from the interior mountains down toward the Lynn Canal, carrying with it the memory of snowfields and caribou paths. It is the lifeblood of a people who have always measured time not in months, but in tides, not in clocks, but in salmon runs. From the high ridges where mountain goats leave narrow traces in the shale, down to the salt-spattered rocks where seals haul their slick bodies into the sun, every contour of this land has been named, sung, hunted, and remembered. Each glacial crevice and river bend holds meaning, not for its beauty, but for what it gave, what it demanded, and what it asked in return. The Chilkat didn't simply live on this land. They were forged by it. Cedar trees, ancient, twisting, weren't just timber. They were ancestors. Their bark became rope, clothing, and matting. Their wood, shaped by adze and fire, became shelter, canoe, and ceremonial crest. To strip a cedar was not to take. It was to ask, with prayer and with song. This bond between people and place ran deeper than subsistence. It shaped the way the Chilkat moved, the way they traded, the way they told stories. From their ocean-facing villages, they gazed not at isolation, but at opportunity. The sea for them was a highway, and their canoes, long and lean, cut across the waves with fierce precision. Each stroke of the paddle was part rhythm, part muscle, and part memory. Haines, or Deishu, as it was once known, marked a meeting point of cultures, paths, and power. It was here that coastal wisdom met inland trade, where salmon smoke curled skyward from communal longhouses and stories of bear hunts or winter starvation were traded beside the crackling of fire. To live in this place meant reading the land like a ledger, to know which creeks the salmon would flood in August, and which slopes would bury you beneath a snowslide in March. It meant watching the movement of clouds over the Chilkoot Range, predicting when the river ice would break, when the bears would stir, when the winds would shift and bring death or fortune on their breath. The land offered no favors. It tested, and those who could not listen, truly listen, to its language, did not last long. In these dense forests, beneath boughs heavy with rain, the Chilkat walked not with dominance, but with deference. Their survival depended not on taming the wild, but on aligning with it, understanding its logic, respecting its moods. In a world where snow could bury the earth in silence for 6 months at a stretch, preparation was everything. Traps were set months before the hunger began. Driftwood was gathered and dried, and seal oil was rendered and stored. Children were taught to snare rabbits with a whisper, to fillet salmon by the light of a dying sun, and to walk barefoot across frozen banks to toughen the skin and teach humility. Because survival here was not just about enduring, it was about deserving to endure. And always, circling above or lurking beneath, were the spirits, ever present, unseen, yet deeply known. The raven, the creator and trickster, the wolf, the protector and guide. They were not myths. They were laws, embedded in clan systems, in storytelling, in birthright. The very fabric of Chilkat society moved to the rhythm of these sacred figures, part animal, part cosmos, all meaning. To be Chilkat was to belong to more than a family. It was to be tethered to generations that stretched like roots deep into the glacial soil. Ancestors were not gone. They were present in the wind that moved through the trees, in the echo of paddles striking tidewater, in the smoke rising from a cedar fire at dusk. And with them came the stories. Of a young boy who followed the bear too far and returned a man. Of a storm that swallowed 4 canoes and taught the people never to mock the sea. Of a woman who wove a blanket so powerful it could only be worn in death. These weren't bedtime tales. They were maps, ethics, warnings. The Chilkat did not write their stories in books. They lived them in hide, in paint, in dance, in carved totems that stared down time itself. At night, when the wind howled through the spruce and the wolves called to the moon, there was no guarantee of tomorrow. So they sang. They chanted. They danced with feet pounding the earth and voices lifted to the sky, asking the spirits to see them, to remember them, to grant one more season, one more catch, one more birth. This is how it begins. Not with conquest, but with reverence. Not with victory, but with balance. The Chilkat homeland was never conquered in the traditional sense. Not by nature, not by neighboring tribes, not even by the early waves of foreign explorers. Because the terrain itself was a fortress, not of stone, but of understanding. You had to know it. You had to earn it. It is said that the land remembers. The mountains hold the footprints of those who dared cross them. That rivers carry the stories of those who bled, wept and thrived along their banks. And if that's true, then the lands of the Chilkat Tlingit are alive with memory. With the echo of footsteps in frozen moss, the whisper of a weaver's chant, the creak of a paddle slicing through icy water before dawn. This is not just the story of a people. It is the story of a place where the glaciers meet the sea, and where survival is not just a condition, but a covenant. The covenant of the Chilkat. And it is only just beginning. Long before the maps were drawn, before Russian ships scraped the icy coves of Sitka, before missionaries laid rail ties across rivers they did not understand, there were trails, carved not by blade or wheel, but by memory, by necessity, and by trust. And of these trails, none was more coveted, more fiercely guarded, than the Grease Trail. Winding from the cold, wet air of the Pacific coast to the dry, wind-bent valleys of the interior, the Grease Trail was not merely a route. It was a lifeline, a corridor of power. And at the heart of it all stood the Chilkat Tlingit. They were not wanderers. They were gatekeepers. To outsiders, the terrain was brutal, a labyrinth of steep ridges, avalanche-prone passes, and shadow-drenched forests where a single misstep could mean a frozen death. But the Chilkat moved through it with precision born of centuries. Every fallen log, every mountain spring, every tree twisted by wind was a waypoint, not an obstacle. Their ancestors had walked it barefoot in winter. They had learned how to carry salmon oil across frozen tundra without spilling a drop, how to trade stories as currency and information as armor. The oil, rendered from the rich Eulachon fish, was the lifeblood of their trade empire. Thick, pungent, and slow to spoil, it was carried inland in carefully sewn containers of seal stomach and cedar bark. A single pouch of grease was worth its weight in copper or fine furs, sometimes more. But it wasn't just the product that mattered, it was who controlled its flow. The Chilkat were masters of this control, not through brute force, but through strategy. They built alliances like scaffolding, slow, calculated, deliberate. Inland Athabascan peoples brought furs, sinew, obsidian. Coastal tribes offered fish, seaweed, woven blankets, and ceremonial goods. But it was the Chilkat who held the pass, the Chilkat who decided who could cross, when, and under what terms. They were middlemen, but in their hands, the middle became the throne. Their longhouses, built with cedar beams thick as oxen and adorned with clan emblems, stood as embassies of this soft power. Inside, fires burned low, and eyes watched every guest. A visitor might trade for a pouch of oil, but leave with a story, a warning, or a debt. Because the Chilkat did not trade goods alone. They traded obligations. One trade deal might bind two families for a generation. Another could provoke a clan feud that simmered for years beneath the calm surface of a potlatch feast. And still, they kept balance. Their society was as structured as any court in Europe, ruled not by kings or queens, but by clans and moieties, bound by lineage and law. A Chilkat child inherited more than a name. They inherited a network, a responsibility. Born into either the raven or the wolf, they knew from an early age that every decision, every alliance, every marriage, even every word, carried weight. The chiefs did not sit on thrones. They stood beside the fire, carved staff in hand, memories in their voice. They were expected to remember not only the names of their ancestors, but the debts of their cousins. The insults traded 3 winters ago, the precise sequence of events in a negotiation with a northern trader 10 seasons past. Forgetfulness was not just shameful, it was dangerous. Because in this world, survival was not secured by isolation. It was earned through diplomacy, through knowing who needed grease this year, who had lost a canoe in a storm, whose daughter was of marrying age, whose clan was hungry for iron, whose enemy was gathering warriors beyond the ridge. Every word spoken across a cedar table, every gift exchanged beneath the carved beams of a longhouse, was part of an invisible ledger, and the Chilkat kept it flawlessly. And it wasn't only in words that they mastered trade. Their canoes were marvels of engineering, hollowed from massive red cedars, fire-softened and shaped by stone adze and patient hands. With high flared ends and a deep belly, they could carry thousands of pounds across churning waves. A crew of 10 could slice through the icy waters of the Lynn Canal, hugging the coastline with uncanny accuracy, guided not by compass, but by starlight, seabird flight, and the whispers of the tide. One Russian explorer, bewildered by their speed and silence, remarked that Chilkat canoes moved like thoughts through the water. He meant it as admiration. It was, in truth, an understatement, because it wasn't just how they moved, but where. Chilkat traders pushed deep into the Yukon interior, through lands no European had yet mapped, forging agreements with far-flung nations whose names had never been spoken in Sitka or San Francisco. They returned with tales of obsidian knives, moose-hide tents, and rituals beneath aurora-filled skies. They brought not just goods, but stories. And in those stories were rumors, intentions, warnings. Trade was intelligence. And intelligence, in this unforgiving land, was power. But power always invites risk. There were rivalries with other Tlingit clans, with Haida raiders, with ambitious outsiders who saw the Chilkat's dominance as a prize worth bleeding for. Some tried to undercut their monopoly by forging direct inland routes. Others brought missionaries and soldiers in their wake, hiding ambition behind the guise of salvation. But the Chilkat adapted. When guns came, they bartered for powder. When iron appeared, they reshaped their tools. When maps were drawn, they learned to navigate not only rivers and trails, but the corridors of colonial power. They did not always win, but they did not vanish. And even in the face of overwhelming change, they remembered that power, real power, came not from hoarding, but from weaving. Weaving relationships, weaving alliances, weaving a world where every canoe was more than transport. It was a message. Every trade was more than commerce. It was a calculation, and every visitor was more than a guest. They were a potential thread in a web that stretched from glacier to forest, to inland plain. This was the Chilkat way, to move unseen, to listen more than speak, to trade not only for today, but for 5 seasons ahead. They stood not on the edge of the world, but at its crossroads, and through strategy, memory, and the soft pressure of oil-soaked diplomacy, they shaped a legacy that the land still remembers. Even now, in the hush of a coastal fog, when a raven circles low above the tide, you can almost hear the whisper of trade talk, soft, careful, deliberate, beneath the crash of distant waves. Because the Chilkat weren't just surviving in the shadows of glaciers and cedar forests, they were ruling from them. In a world where silence could be survival, where one wrong move in the forest might mean a winter without food, the Chilkat spoke in symbols, and their most powerful language was woven. Long before the word weaving evoked looms and fabric mills, before the clatter of industry drowned out the rhythm of tradition, the Chilkat Tlingit were bending time and memory into cloth, shaping the sacred with nothing more than bark, wool, and breath. It began not in a workshop, but on a mountain. High in the coastal ranges of Alaska, where the wind scrapes stone and snow clings year-round to jagged spines, the mountain goat walks a narrow path between danger and dominion. With hooves like stone and eyes sharp as the raven's, it is nearly untouchable, but the Chilkat knew how to find it. A woman would rise before dawn, moccasins laced, sinew cord coiled at her hip. She would walk alone into the high ridges, not to kill, but to wait. She would trace the ancient paths known only to the elders, paths that shimmered in the memory of her mother and her mother's mother before that. There, among the lichen and snowfields, she would gather what the goat left behind. Tufts of wool snagged on a branch, shed beneath a pine, tangled among rocks. It was patience work, slow work, but it began the transformation of spirit into thread. The wool was mixed with strips of softened cedar bark, then pounded, soaked, and spun into long strands. Every fiber twisted by hand, every inch remembered, because weaving a Chilkat robe, a Na Saxw, was not about speed, it was about honor. These robes were not clothing, they were story. A single piece could take a year or more to complete. The process was so sacred, so detailed, that only the most skilled women, those chosen and trained, were trusted to carry it forward. They sat cross-legged before vertical, looms fashioned from alder wood. There was no written pattern, no instructions. The designs came from vision, spiritual, mathematical, inherited. The curves, ovoids, and crescents of the form-line style were drawn first in the weaver's mind, then sketched in charcoal, then sung into the threads with a rhythm passed down through breath, not ink. The form line was more than aesthetic. It was ancestral geometry, a visual code of balance, tension, and relation. Every swirl, every tapering line carried the essence of clan, creature, cosmos. To the untrained eye, it might appear abstract. A wave of black, yellow, blue, and white twisting across soft fibers. But to the Chilkat, it was a living map. The raven's beak curling around a copper shield, the wolf's eye watching from the shadows of a clan crest, the ancestral canoe that carried the first people across the sea of stars. Each symbol connected its wearer to lineage, to responsibility, to the dead. These cloaks were worn by chiefs during potlatches, draped across shoulders like thunderclouds of memory. When the leader walked into the longhouse, the robe spoke first. It said, "This man remembers." It said, "This clan still walks in the footsteps of its ancestors." It said, "We have not forgotten who we are." And yet, it was the women, silent, often unseen, who kept that memory alive. Their names are seldom etched into ledgers or recorded in missionary journals. But without them, the stories would have unraveled. Women like Waltine, who wove 3 robes during the darkest winters of the smallpox years. Or Kayasar, who memorized 30 formline designs after losing her vision to fire smoke. Or Jenny Thlunot, a master weaver who lived into the 20th century. Her fingers stiff with age, but still capable of pulling memory through thread. Jenny once said, "You must have balance in your life to make balance in the weave." It wasn't just technique, it was philosophy. Weaving required stillness, presence. Every movement had intention, every knot, a prayer. When a woman sat at the loom, she did not simply create. She became a bridge between animal and spirit, past and future. She was part priestess, part historian, part engineer, and in that sacred silence, the loom sang. It whispered stories of old migrations, clan feuds settled by marriage, children born in spring rain. It remembered the dead, their crests, their dances, their debts. A finished robe was a voice, and it could not lie. Which is why, during the years of invasion, when missionaries tore down longhouses and forbade native ceremonies, when Chilkat children were taken to distant schools and forbidden to speak their language, the weaving continued, not always in public, not always in full. But thread by thread, the stories were kept. In basements, in forest shelters, in the hush between fear and survival. Weaving became resistance. When the ceremonies were banned, the robes were hidden, wrapped in sealskin, buried beneath floorboards, stored in cedar chests with a pinch of sage and a whispered blessing. The women knew that to lose the robe was to lose the name, and to lose the name was to vanish entirely. Some robes were stolen, carted off to museums and collectors, labeled as artifacts from a dying race. But they were wrong. The race did not die. The stories did not fade. The cloaks still spoke. And when the time came, when revival stirred like embers beneath ash, it was the weavers who remembered. Today, young women and men return to the vertical loom. They run their fingers across old robes and feel the pulse of memory. They learn not just the curves of the form line, but the discipline required to uphold it. Because to wear a Chilkat robe is to carry the weight of generations, not just in wool and bark, but in meaning. At potlatches once again held in cedar-scented longhouses, the robes return. They move across the floor like glaciers reborn, heavy, deliberate, ancient. When the drumbeat begins and the dancers step forward, the cloaks ripple. Eyes peer from their woven faces. Raven cries echo in the firelit dark. And the people remember. They remember that some languages are never spoken. They are woven. Some seasons pass gently. The slow melt of snow, the silver hush of salmon returning to spawn. But some seasons arrive like thunder. And for the Chilkat Tlingit, the turn of the 18th and 19th centuries did not whisper. It roared. By the time European powers found the outer edges of this land, when their sails first pierced the icy mist of the Lynn Canal, the Chilkat had already built a legacy of dominance and diplomacy. They were masters of trade, navigators of diplomacy, and gatekeepers to the interior. But power, in every form, draws predators, and the tide was rising. First came whispers, then strangers. The Russians arrived in creaking ships, pale-faced and iron-laden, their coats thick and their eyes hungering for fur. Sea otter pelts, soft, dark, and nearly waterproof, were more valuable than gold in St. Petersburg. The Aleutians had already been broken, their homes razed, their people forced to hunt for their oppressors. And now the Russians looked south, to the Chilkat coast. But the Chilkats were not so easily bent. Unlike many isolated bands the Russians had encountered, the Chilkat were neither unprepared nor naive. They had seen the ripple of conquest move across the northern coasts. They had heard stories of children stolen, of hunters shot for refusing tribute, of entire villages laid bare, and they prepared. Canoes were hidden in side coves. Weapons were sharpened. Watchmen were posted high on ridgelines where ravens circled overhead like omens. And yet, the Russians did not attack with gunfire alone. They brought something colder and crueler. Smallpox. It arrived not with a scream, but with a cough. A child fell ill, then her mother, then an elder, the entire clan. The disease moved faster than any war party, striking from within, leaving swollen faces, blistered skin, breathless deaths. The Chilkat had no immunity, no warning. And in less than a decade, entire houses stood silent, their fire pits cold. They burned the dead with cedar and spruce, hoping the smoke would carry away the sickness. But even fire could not keep pace. Survivors marked the trail with grief. Bundles of weaving left unfinished. Clan stories lost with the last elder who knew them by heart. Still, the Chilkat endured. And from that suffering came steel. Guns, once a novelty, became a necessity. Flintlock muskets, traded through distant Haida routes or directly from Russian posts, began to shift the balance of survival. For a people raised with war clubs, obsidian blades, and stealth, the firearm was a dangerous tool, but one they learned quickly to wield. Some clans grew stronger through this trade. Others fell into quiet resentment. Tensions simmered between neighboring groups, Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian. Old rivalries flared under the heat of new weaponry. Raids became bloodier. Feuds once settled by potlatch debts now ended with musket fire in the night. And amidst this chaos, the Americans came. They did not arrive in force, not at first. They came with papers and promises. Traders, explorers, surveyors. Men like Captain Charles Wilkes, who charted the coastline in 1841, described the Chilkat as a proud people, not easily provoked, but impossible to deceive. He was half right. What Wilkes and others did not understand, or perhaps refused to, was that the Chilkat's pride was not born of arrogance. It was defense, a necessity, a sharpened shell against the encroaching tide of foreign appetite. With every new ship came more disease, more competition, more demand. The price of otter pelts soared. The interior Athabascans became targets for rival traders. The once careful balance along the Grease Trail began to wobble under the weight of colonial commerce. And yet, the Chilkat adapted. They tightened their alliances, reaffirmed old kinship bonds, and restructured their trade routes, shifting their operations to control not only goods, but knowledge. They used their deep understanding of terrain to set traps, not just for animals, but for outsiders. Ambushes were not declared with banners. They were whispered in fog, struck from tree lines, and vanished with the tide. They learned who to trust and who to let walk into the snow, never to return. There are stories still told in the villages of a Haida raiding party that vanished in the upper Chilkat Valley. Their canoes later found drifting, empty, save for one blood-soaked blanket tangled on the bow. Or of a Russian envoy who insulted a Chilkat chief during negotiations and never made it back to his ship, lost somewhere between the feast and the forest. But the Chilkat were not brutes. Their resistance was not born of savagery, but strategy. When conflict could be avoided, it was. When trade could secure peace, it did. They understood that a burned village left no one to barter with, that an enemy humiliated today might become an ally tomorrow. Every decision was a calculation, weighed not only in blood, but in time, reputation, and memory. A Chilkat chief once said, "The river does not shout as it carves the mountain, but it moves it all the same." That was their philosophy. Quiet, enduring, relentless, still. The mountain was shifting. By the 1850s, American interests in Alaska were growing. Rumors of gold and timber, of missionary settlements and military forts began to encircle the Chilkat lands like smoke before a fire. And with each passing year, the pressure mounted. Longhouses were burned under suspicion of harboring weapons. Children were taken to mission schools, stripped of language, renamed in foreign tongues. Ceremonies were outlawed. Potlatches were labeled as heathen waste. Even the cloaks, sacred symbols of identity, were confiscated or bought for pennies and shipped to museums in New York or London. But through all of it, the Chilkat remembered. They remembered the terrain, the hidden passes, the edible roots in the high alpine, the way snow crusts sounds differently over frozen water than over dead leaves, the way the raven's call changes before a storm. They remembered each trail carved by ancestors, each story etched into the lines of a carved staff. They remembered how to survive when no one else thought they could. The land that had once protected them, with its jagged cliffs, its shifting tides, its bone-deep winters, now became their refuge again. And they returned to it. Into the mountains, into the forest, into the folds of snow and memory. Because when the world changes beneath your feet, you do not always fight. Sometimes you endure. The Chilkat did both, and the river remembers. Even now, when the fog hangs low on the Chilkat River and the eagle cries out from the high spruce, some say you can still hear the quiet footsteps of watchmen on the ridges, still feel the weight of eyes in the trees, still see the flicker of a fire that's never gone out, because the invasion came. But the people remained. When the snow began to recede from the mountain flanks, when the river broke free of its icebound silence, and the salmon stirred once more in the distant sea, the people gathered. They came from across fjords and valleys, down winding trails carved into memory, arriving not with fear, but with purpose. The longhouses were swept, the fires built high, the drums were tightened, the robes unwrapped from cedar chests that smelled of smoke and salt. This was not a time for war, it was a time for remembering. They called it a potlatch. To outsiders, it looked like excess. Feasting, dancing, painted masks, and elaborate speeches, followed by the giving away of wealth, blankets, copper, food, even canoes. Colonial officials, missionaries, and traders misunderstood it completely. They called it wasteful, uncivilized. But they were blind to the truth, because to the Chilkat, potlatch was not indulgence. It was the law, ceremony, a reckoning of debts, a reaffirmation of alliances, a stage upon which identity itself was carved. And at the center of it all stood the raven and the wolf, two moieties, two pillars, not enemies, never that, but halves of a whole. Every Chilkat belonged to one, and marriage across the line was the sacred rule. Raven could not marry raven, wolf could not marry wolf. In this way, every union wove the community tighter, ensured that bloodlines never curled back upon themselves like dead limbs on a cedar tree. Each child bore the crest of the mother's moiety, not just a name, but an entire cosmology. Their very birthright carried with it obligations, stories, songs, and ancestral roles. And in the potlatch, all of this came to life. The longhouse was filled with smoke and voices. Children were hushed. Elders took their places by the fire. The guests sat not randomly, but according to lineage and rank, each position a signal, each absence a silence. A raven chief would rise. His robe was heavy with woven memory, his staff carved with faces that watched the flames. He would speak not for himself, but for his clan. He would name the dead, a grandfather who passed during the harsh freeze 2 winters prior, a niece taken by smallpox, a warrior who never returned from the pass. With each name, the crowd would nod. With each story, memory was stitched back into the fabric of the people. Then came the dancers. Painted masks, half human, half beast, emerged from the shadows. A raven with eyes like fire, wings beating against the sky. A wolf, teeth bared, stalking slowly around the fire pit. Its every movement a lesson, a story, a warning. The drums spoke in rhythms older than words. 1 heartbeat, then 2, then a surge, like river over stone, and the dancers whirled. Feet slammed the cedar floor. Cloaks rose and fell like tides. The stories were not spoken. They were embodied. There was one dance, rarely seen, spoken of in low voices, where the raven, in fury, stole the sun and hid it in a box. The dancer would stagger around the fire, clutching a blackened chest, while the others cried out in desperation. And then, with a scream, the chest would burst open, and a flare of light would bathe the room. The lesson was simple, eternal. Balance must be restored, even when it breaks. After the dances came the gifts. Blankets woven tight, with borders dyed in clan colours, copper shields etched with clan crests, tools, salmon dried and bound in woven twine, cedar baskets filled with berries, furs, sand eel oil. The more you gave, the more you were respected. To hoard wealth was not power. It was a weakness. It meant you did not trust your people to carry you when your strength faltered. But to give until your shelves were bare, your coffers empty, your robes handed off your shoulders. That was the mark of a true chief, and it wasn't random. Every gift followed a ledger, not written, but spoken and remembered. The aunt who had helped raise your cousin, the man who had sung the funeral song for your father, the neighboring clan that had sent meat during a hard winter. Every act, every kindness, every insult and honor, it was all accounted for. And now it was paid back, with interest. Children watched and learned. They saw what generosity looked like, what leadership meant. Not dominance, but memory. Not control, but balance. And through it all, the raven and the wolf watched. Sometimes a new name was given during Pa-Otlach. A child reached a certain age. A hunter achieved a great feat. A widow took on the role of clan elder. The naming was not casual. It was sacred. A chief would step forward, take a coal from the fire, and draw a mark on the forehead. The name was spoken aloud, echoing across the longhouse walls. From that moment forward, the person bore the name and the weight of those who came before. They walked in the steps of their ancestors, and they were never alone again. Potlatch wasn't just a ceremony, it was survival. When the missionaries came, they outlawed it, called it pagan, called it a threat to order, because they saw that the potlatch created a strength they couldn't touch, a unity that did not require churches or governors. They saw that as long as the people gathered, remembered, danced, and gave, they could not be conquered in spirit. But the Chilkat held on, even when forced into silence, even when the fires were doused and the masks hidden. They remembered. Some potlatches were held in secret, in small homes, behind shuttered doors, with watchers posted by the window. The drums were muffled by blankets. The gifts were given in whispers, and still they endured. Because without ritual, the stories unravel. Without the songs, the names are lost. And without the balance between raven and wolf, the world begins to tip. Today, potlatch is no longer hidden. Once again, the people gather. They sing the old songs. They dance the old steps. They speak the names of their dead and birth new names into the firelight. Children watch. Elders smile. And the cloaks that speak, rise and fall with each heartbeat of the drum. Because in this land, wealth is not what you keep, it's what you give away. The wind had changed. It did not howl like a storm or break like thunder, but it shifted. Slow, relentless. A different kind of cold, not from snow or sea, but from a distant fire stoked by men who neither knew the land nor listened to it. And with that wind came the missionaries, the gold, and the iron ships. The Chilkat, once stewards of the trails that threaded coast to interior, traders who held power in silence and in strategy, now faced something they had not prepared for, not entirely. Not because they were naive, but because what was coming could not be met with diplomacy or clan memory. It wasn't a war in the forest or a trade gone wrong. It was erasure. The first to arrive wore long black coats and carried books bound in leather. They spoke of salvation, of heaven and sin, but their words were foreign, their tone rigid. These were the missionaries, agents of an empire not drawn on maps, but etched in crosses and the fear of hell. They came with an urgency, as if every Chilkat soul was a ticking clock. Their churches were built near the waterline, steeples rising against the grey Alaskan sky like fingers of judgment. The children were the first to feel it. They were taken to mission schools, some willingly, others by pressure or threat. At the gates, their Chilkat names were stripped away. Their hair, once tied in clan braids, was cut short. They were forbidden to speak their language. If they slipped, even in whispers, they were punished. A slap to the mouth, a day without food, isolation. The punishment was not for noise, it was for memory. The missionaries did not understand that to forbid a child their language was not just discipline, it was dismemberment. Every word in Tlingit was a strand in a vast web. A river could not be described without naming its salmon. A name could not be spoken without invoking lineage. To remove language was to unmoor a child from their ancestors and set them adrift in a world they did not yet know how to navigate. But still, the people endured. Elders began to teach in secret, lessons murmured at dusk beside the hearth, stories disguised as lullabies. The children who could not speak during the day would chant their clan histories at night, beneath cedar rafters, where the missionaries would not hear. Yet even as they resisted, the ground beneath them was cracking. In 1896, gold was discovered near the Klondike River, hundreds of miles inland, but close enough to ripple through every village on the Chilkat Trail. Almost overnight, the ancient Grease Trail, once guarded by memory, ceremony, and selective permission, became a rush of boot prints and wagon wheels. Prospectors flooded the region, men with beards thick as moss and voices loud with greed. They came from Seattle, from San Francisco, from distant cities that had never known silence, and they brought with them iron. The steamships pulled into the fjords like metal leviathans. Their hulls creaked with weight, rails, mining tools, crates of dried meat and canned peaches. From their smokestacks billowed black clouds that smudged the mountains. At first, the Chilkat watched them from the ridges, unsure if they were ships or monsters. But the true monster was not steel, it was speed. With gold fever came roads, timber bridges, hastily laid planks, surveyors with tape and iron stakes. The Dalton Trail, once a sacred artery, was carved open and repurposed. Where once only a Chilkat chief could grant passage, now settlers marched unchecked, rifles slung over shoulders, eyes fixed on distant treasure. Every mile of progress was a wound. Villages once teeming with trade were bypassed. Ceremonial grounds became campsites. Streams where grandmothers had once rinsed cedar bark were now clogged with silt and whiskey bottles. And through it all, the economy shifted like a tide turned sour. The old system, based on reciprocity, memory, and the value of what was given, began to unravel in the face of cash. A blanket no longer carried the weight of lineage. It was bartered for coins. A canoe, once the gift of a chief to a visiting clan, became just another object to sell to white men desperate for river passage. The concept of wealth had changed, and with it, the identity of power. Some Chilkat, especially the young, were pulled into the new economy. They worked as guides, packers, dock workers. Others ran small shops, sold salmon to traders, or offered lodging to prospectors. It was not betrayal, it was survival. But with every trade, a little more of the old world dimmed. One elder, his name now lost to record, was heard to say, "Our children speak English and carry coins, but they forget to carry our names." There was no anger in his voice, just a sadness as deep as the winter snowpack, quiet, heavy, and slow to melt. And then came the railroad. It arrived like prophecy. Rails stretching north, bolted into the very bones of the land. The rhythm of drums was replaced by the scream of engines, the beat of hammers. The forests near the trails were cut, the bare paths blocked. The old markers, that certain rock near the bend, that tree shaped like a bent arm, were swallowed by gravel and progress. Where once the Chilkat moved through silence, now they were drowned by the iron scream of a world not made for them. But even in this moment, this breaking, not everything was lost. Some families hid their regalia in caves. Some women wove designs into blankets that looked plain to outsiders, but told full stories to those who knew how to read the curves. The children who were punished for their language grew into adults who carried it in secret, passing it on when they could. A word here, a song there, like seeds buried in frost. The Chilkat were being broken, but they were also bending, and in the world of cedar and glacier, of raven cries and carved staffs, there is a lesson. that which bends can survive the storm. Not all did. Some stories were lost. Some lines of knowledge ended in silence. But others endured. Because even as the iron ships came, as gold glinted in the eyes of strangers, as language was forbidden and roads torn through sacred valleys, the Chilkat heart remained. It beat beneath the new noise, beneath the tread of boots and the echo of trains. It beat in the forest, in the whisper of snowmelt, in the rustle of wool spun beside a fire few now saw. And one day, it would beat loudly again. When everything else was taken, names, language, ceremony, land, there was still the forest. It stood silent when the churches rose. It bent in the wind when the train tracks came. It shed its leaves and waited, patient, while one world collapsed and another rushed in to replace it. The Chilkat had always known the forest wasn't just trees. It was a memory. It was medicine. It was the teacher who never betrayed. And when the missionaries outlawed the dances, when the traders took the grease trail and sold it for roads and maps, many Chilkat turned away from the noise and back to the green silence that had fed them for generations. This was not a retreat. It was survival. There is an old saying, when the world forgets you, the river remembers your name. That river, the Chilkat, winds through a valley carved by glacier and myth. In its current life, salmon and story, its stones smoothed by time and footsteps, both human and bear. And alongside it, a Chilkat elder, bent with years but eyes sharp as obsidian, crouched by the bank. She was teaching a boy how to fish, not with a net or a rod, with his hands. The water was glacial, biting through skin, but the boy kept still. His breath was shallow. His fingers spread like cedar roots in the gravel. Minutes passed. Then, movement. The boy's hand shot forward, a flash of silver, a wriggle. He held the salmon up with both hands, wide-eyed, laughing, and the elder smiled. "Now you've asked the river," she said, and it answered. This was how it began again, not in classrooms, not on stages, but in quiet places where tradition had never truly left. It only waited. Upstream, in the shade of towering red cedar, another Chilkat man ran his fingers along the bark of a tree. He wasn't logging. He wasn't carving yet. He was listening. There is a way cedar speaks to those who know how to hear it. A certain feel in the grain, a dryness in the fibers signals whether it's ready. The tree was chosen, not just by size, but by spirit. It was honored with words, a strand of hair tied around a low branch, a sign of connection, of respect. Then came the adze. Stone tools had long been replaced by iron, but the rhythm remained the same. Chip, pull, breathe. The canoe was not carved into the wood, but out of it, released, as if it had always been waiting inside. Over weeks, the shape emerged, long, narrow, strong in the spine, wide enough to carry a clan, sharp enough to ride waves and survive storms. Children watched, wide-eyed, asking questions. Why that wood? Why this shape? What happens if it cracks? And the elders answered, not just with words, but with demonstration. They lit fires inside the hollowed-out form, let the heat expand the wood, slowly widening the canoe's belly. It wasn't brute force, it was patience, precision, knowing when to bend and when to yield. In another part of the forest, an old woman knelt beside a fallen spruce. The tree had shed its pitch, amber and thick, onto the moss. She gathered it with a bone blade, careful not to damage the bark. That pitch, when boiled with ash, became medicine. It sealed wounds, fought infection, held canoes together, even lit fires when the weather turned cruel and nothing else would catch. She taught this to her granddaughter, showed her how to test the pitch between her fingers, how to smell its strength, how to find the dry pockets even in the wettest wood. For generations, these skills had been passed down, not as hobbies or folklore, but as lifelines. Because when the economy collapsed, when the missionaries left, when promises of statehood brought only more displacement, what remained? The land, the forest, The hands. A Chilkat boy in the 1940s once asked his grandfather, "Why do you make the old canoe if we have a motorboat?" The grandfather pointed to the river. "When the fuel is gone," he said, "the cedar still floats." That boy later became a canoe carver. In the face of erasure, bushcraft became resistance. To catch a fish without a hook, to build a fire in freezing rain, to find food in bark and berries and root. These were not curiosities. They were declarations. We are still here. When government agents arrived, asking for land deeds and legal titles, the Chilkat walked the land barefoot and said, "This stone is our record. This trail is our claim." When school teachers punished children for speaking Tlingit, the elders brought those same children to the woods and taught them to name every plant by its true name. They carved stories into the beams of cabins, painted clan symbols on paddles. He hid his memory in plain sight, because the forest didn't forget, even in the darkest winters, when rations were thin and the world outside seemed determined to forget the Chilkat ever existed. The land provided. The snowshoe hare, snared with a noose made of twisted root. The ptarmigan, flushed from alder groves. The fireweed root, bitter but nourishing. Spruce tips for tea. Devil's club bark for pain. These were not mere survival tools. They were links in a broken chain slowly being reforged. In the late 20th century, anthropologists and state officials arrived with notebooks and cameras, eager to document the dying traditions. They photographed the canoe builders, recorded the weavers, wrote articles about vanishing knowledge. But the Chilkat knew the truth. You cannot vanish what lives in the land. Today, those same children who were once told their ways were backward now lead survival camps. They teach others how to read the moss on the north side of a cedar, how to find the edible marrow in a fire-split fern root, how to track deer through snow so fine it squeaks beneath the foot. And when they speak, it is not in shame, it is in pride. They speak in Tlingit. They speak in the rhythm of the adze, the splash of the paddle into the current, the slow peeling of bark from a tree. Because every action in the bush is an act of remembering. The land had always been the first teacher, and in the time of forgetting, it became the last refuge. Not because the Chilkat wished to return to the past, but because the forest held what the future threatened to erase. A canoe, hand-carved from cedar, now rests in a museum. But its twin floats on the Chilkat River, carrying children and elders through the same bends, under the same trees, watched by the same eagles who have seen it all before. The forest remembers, and because of that, so do they. There are silences so deep, they echo. Not the silence of wilderness, of snow drifting through cedar limbs or river mist rising before dawn. That silence carries life, breath, memory. No, this was a silence of absence. The silence that followed footsteps, boots on plank floors, as collectors entered longhouses under the banner of preservation. The silence that filled the loom room when no hands returned to weave. The silence that fell when stories, once sung into being, were boxed, labelled, and sealed behind museum glass. This is the silence the Chilkat remember. It began slowly, like a fog rolling in from the sea. First, the outsiders came with curiosity, sketchbooks in hand, eager eyes. They asked questions, watched ceremonies, admired the cloaks, the masks, the poles carved with histories written in formline. Then came offers. Then came trades. Then came theft. At first, it was framed as an interest. "We must preserve this," they said. "Your people are vanishing," they insisted, not knowing or not caring that by taking the sacred, they were helping make that prophecy true, and so the looms went quiet. In the early 1900s, with the potlatch banned with language outlawed, the very act of weaving became dangerous. Chilkat blankets, those intricate works of cedar and mountain goat wool, those cloaks that sang lineage and thundered legacy, could no longer be worn in public. Their motifs were seen not as sacred, but as primitive art to be catalogued and commodified. Many women, masters of a tradition passed down through the fingers of their mothers and grandmothers, were forced to hide their tools. The loom frames were disassembled and stowed in the rafters. The patterns memorized, not drawn, whispered into sleep like bedtime prayers. Still, collectors came. They traveled from New York, from London, from Berlin. They entered homes with cash, flattery, or veiled threats. Some offered rifles. Others promised that the pieces would be honored in their museums. Some simply took what they wanted when no one was watching. By 1920, dozens of sacred Chilkat robes, each representing generations of knowledge, grief, ceremony, were gone. Not worn, not danced, not seen again by the people who birthed them. Totem poles were pried from the earth. Carved house screens hacked in half to fit crates. Ritual masks, still bearing the breath of their last dancer, were packed alongside shipping hay like cargo. They called it preservation, but to the Chilkat, it was desecration. A robe, once wrapped around a chief as he named the dead during a potlatch, now hung lifeless on a sterile wall in a gallery. Its fringe was still twisted in the old way, its forlorn eyes still watching, though now unblinking, unseen by those who once knew how to read their gaze. In Chilkat belief, objects are not just objects. They carry memory, spirit. A robe woven with a crest is not decoration, it is voice. To separate it from its people is to mute it. To hang it behind glass is to silence it forever. One elder, speaking in a recorded interview in the 1980s, said, "When they took the robe, they didn't just take cloth. They took our names, our mother's hands, our dances, our birth." She wasn't being poetic. She was telling the truth. With each artifact taken, a strand of connection frayed. A child born in the 1930s might have known their clan crest, but never seen it worn, never felt the weight of a woven blanket on their shoulders, never heard the rhythm of the loom or the hum of a song guiding the weft. And so, the stories grew faint. There are words in Tlingit that do not translate. One of them means something close to grief carried across generations. It is not loud. It does not wail. It lingers like cold smoke. That was the grief the Chilkat carried. And yet, even in the face of this loss, some remembered. In a coastal village, far from the eyes of tourists and curators, a woman named Kaskaya opened her cedar chest. Inside, wrapped in hide, were fragments, yarn spun by her grandmother, patterns inked on old hide, a loom board weathered by decades of disuse. She began to weave. It was slow. Her fingers remembered what her body did not. The tension of the warp, the weight of the wool, the twist of cedar fiber softened in river water. For hours she sat in silence, save for the creak of the frame and the beat of her heart. Each strand a resurrection. Her daughter watched, and soon learned. They did not announce it. There was no grand unveiling, just the quiet reclaiming of what had been stolen. In another town, a young man traced a robe once worn by his great-grandfather, now hanging in a Seattle museum. He sketched it from memory, from photographs, from the stories of his aunt. He carved the crest into a new staff, not as an imitation, as continuity. In recent years, institutions have begun returning items, sometimes by choice, more often by pressure. Ceremonial poles lowered from museum ceilings and returned to the soil that once birthed them. Blankets folded in reverence and carried home not as artifacts, but as ancestors. But even as these items return, something remains broken. Because some stories are gone. A pattern woven once, but never passed on. A name whispered during a potlatch and never spoken again. A weaving song, hummed for centuries, but silenced by punishment and time. That's the thing with culture. It does not die all at once. It fades, and in that fading, whole generations can be born not knowing what they've lost. But the Chilkat are not just victims of theft. They are architects of return. Weaving circles now gather again in longhouses, in schoolrooms, in homes. The loom is no longer silent. Young girls learn from women who once feared to teach. The yarn carries both pain and pride. Each new cloak carries the weight of what was nearly lost, and the joy of what is found again. At a gathering last winter, in a potlatch newly restored, a robe, woven from scratch using the old designs, was worn for the first time in 70 years. As the dancer moved, the fringe rose like waves. The crowd fell silent, not from grief, but reverence. Because the robe was not a costume, it was a story, and the loom, once silent, had found its voice again. In the hush of a cedar-walled room, the sound of weaving returns. It begins not with drums or songs, but with a hush, the hum of fingers against wool, the creak of a loom reborn from memory. The thread pulls taut, the cedar fibers twist, the goat wool folds in, then comes the rhythm, beat by beat, as if time, once torn, is being stitched together again. It is not loud, but it is a revolution. In the late 20th century, when the world had long presumed the old ways of the Chilkat to be relics of the past, one woman stood at the edge of history and pulled the thread forward. Her name was Jenny Thlunot. To some, she was simply an elder, soft-spoken, hair-bound in the old way. But to those who knew, Jenny was a living archive, perhaps the last fully trained Chilkat weaver, born into a world where the old looms still spoke, where blankets told stories before they were silenced by colonization and museums. Born in 1891 in Kluquan, Jenny had learned from the matriarchs, women whose hands held memory deeper than words. She wove her first robe in her teens, in the shadow of elders who had watched the old potlatches before the ban. She remembered the scent of smoked cedar, the chant of patterns passed hand to hand, and the sacred responsibility of wrapping someone in a story only they could carry. For Jenny, weaving was never art. It was a ceremony. Each thread was a heartbeat of her ancestors, and for decades, Jenny worked quietly. Her loom a sanctuary in a world growing louder with foreign tongues and synthetic things. Most never knew what she carried. The weaving, after all, had become nearly invisible. Only a handful still held the knowledge. Fewer still knew how to pass it on. But Jenny knew, and she chose to give it. In the 1970s, with cultural resurgence stirring across native communities, Jenny stepped forward. She began to teach, not for fame, not for spectacle, but because the stories, woven into warp and fringe, could not be buried with her. She took on apprentices, young women and men, some Chilkat, some from neighboring clans, some who had grown up speaking English and doubting their place in a culture they feared was lost. Jenny looked at them, placed a strand of wool in their palm, and said, "You start here. This is your name. You just forgot it for a while." And so the thread began to return, not all at once, slowly, as fingers fumbled at first, as patterns were misaligned, as elders corrected and guided, as wool twisted under unsure pressure. But slowly, the hands remembered. Weaving workshops were held in tribal centers, in school basements, in coastal cabins where wind tapped on glass, and old looms stood waiting like ghosts. Jenny taught that every design had meaning, the ovoids, the crescents, the negative space that spoke just as loudly as what was drawn. The patterns were not just aesthetic, they were relational, marking bloodlines, kinship, and spirit connections. To copy one without understanding was to speak a name without permission. This was sacred work. Through Jenny's students, the knowledge rippled outward. Names like Anna Brown Ehlers and Clarissa Rizal carried the teachings further. They translated not into English, but into action, into new robes woven not as replicas, but as resurrections. In Juneau, a child sits cross-legged on a woven mat, holding her mother's fringe in her lap. She asks what it means. Her mother answers, not with a textbook, but with the story of a raven who brought light, of a wolf who guarded memory, of a grandmother whose loom once stood where this floor now rests. The child listens, then touches the thread. In Sitka, a group of women chant in unison as they weave. Their voices rise with each pull of the weft, echoing an old tradition where song kept rhythm and rhythm kept memory. Their robes will take months, sometimes years, not because the work is difficult, but because it is deliberate. Each stitch, a declaration, we are still here. And what was once a silent loom has become a symphony. But this resurgence is not simply about craft. It is about repair. The robes woven now are not identical to those of a century past, and they are not meant to be. They carry the same DNA, but also new threads. The thread of return, of healing, of a people who survived erasure and now refuse invisibility. One master weaver said, "I weave to remember. I weave to fight forgetting, and when I wrap someone in this robe, I'm giving them a history no one can take away." And the ceremonies have returned too. Potlatches are no longer outlawed. The drumming, once silenced by missionaries, now rolls again through the longhouses. Children walk barefoot across cedar floors under the gaze of elders who never thought they'd see this day. A robe, hand-woven from start to finish, is draped over the shoulders of a new clan leader. Its fringe sways as she speaks her ancestral name aloud, a name once forbidden in schools that taught silence instead of truth. This is not nostalgia. This is reclamation. For the Chilkat, weaving was never just about the past. It was about continuity. What Jenny Thlunot preserved was not just a method, but a worldview. One where objects carry spirit, where hands teach what books cannot, where time is not linear but layered, each generation stitched into the one before. Jenny passed in 1986, but her work did not. Her students became teachers. Their students now carry on the thread, and the forest remembers. The goats still roam the alpine. The cedar still offers its bark. The rivers still run cold and strong. The loom frames, once hidden in attics and sheds, are being rebuilt, sturdy and tall, singing again with the tension of ancestral fiber. In museums across the world, some of Jenny's early robes still hang, but they are no longer seen as tombstones of a lost culture. They are mirrors, reflections of what was and what has returned. One day, a Chilkat weaver stood in front of such a robe in Washington, D.C. She looked at it, tears welling, and whispered, "They tried to freeze you in time, but I'm bringing you home." And she did, thread by thread. Weaving is not survival, it is a rebirth. The sound is cedar, not just the scent of it, sweet, rich, oily as it splits under the adze, but the sound of it. A slow, steady rhythm that echoes through the forest. Thunk, pull, breathe. Thunk, pull, like a heartbeat buried deep beneath the bark. Each strike draws out the shape, the spirit, the memory of something that was never truly gone. Here, at the foot of the mountains where the river braids itself into the sea, the Chilkat are building again. Not tents, not temporary dwellings, clan houses, massive longhouses carved from red cedar, resting on the same soil their ancestors walked. Not imitations of the past, but continuations of it, rising like memory from the land. In the old days, every house was a story. The crest carved into the central beam was not just decoration, it was a declaration, a lineage, a right, a responsibility. The eagle and the raven, the wolf and the killer whale. Each figure is watching, warning, and protecting. To enter a house was to enter a living body, the walls, its ribs, the fire, its breath. Those who slept inside didn't just rest, they belonged. For decades, these houses stood empty or broken, torn down by missionaries, replaced by government housing, their poles taken, their carvings sold. The memory of them drifted into black and white photographs and sketches in dusty archives. For a time, even some Chilkat children grew up not knowing what a clan house truly was. But the memory was never erased, only buried. Now, the adze returns, In Haines, under a sky smeared with snow clouds, builders gather around a fallen cedar, chosen not just for its size, but for its spirit. It is laid flat across scaffolds. Elders step forward first, pressing hands to bark, offering words, Tlingit prayers passed from elder to elder. Then the work begins. Cedar does not yield easily. It demands patience, knowledge, respect. The builders work in layers, drawing out not just beams and boards, but ancestors. At the same time, carvers labor nearby on totemic posts. A master carver, hands stained with ochre, gouges deep into the grain. His blade reveals a raven's wing, curved, deliberate, symbolic. He does not trace blindly. Each cut follows a story, a genealogy, a memory. When asked what the carving means, he smiles and says, "It's not what it means, it's who it is." These figures, towering, painted, bold, are not art. They are ancestors. When the first beam is raised, the entire community gathers. Women bring food. Children sit in tight rows. The elders stand tall, their eyes glassy not with grief, but awe. One woman whispers, "My grandmother was born in a house like this. She died without ever seeing one again. But today, she trails off. No need to finish. The house speaks for itself." Its walls rise with slow precision. The roof timbers fit like puzzle pieces, angled to the storms, sloped to the snow. The joints are fitted without nails, locked with wooden pegs and ancestral engineering. Inside, there is no electricity, no insulation, but there is warmth from fire, from song, from the echo of ceremony long dormant. On the back wall, a house screen begins to take shape. Painted by hand, it stretches from floor to rafter, a vibrant wash of black, red, and blue. The formline figures, raven with eyes wide, wolf with teeth bared, do not simply decorate the space, they animate it. In front of the screen, the fire pit, not symbolic, functional. Here, the potlatches will return. Here, stories will be told. Here, a child will hear their name spoken by an elder and know it has always belonged to something greater than themselves. This is not just architecture, it is restoration. Across the Pacific Northwest, other nations have rebuilt their clan houses, Haida, Tsimshian, Tlingit. But for the Chilkat, whose history is braided with both resilience and erasure, this moment is especially powerful. Because here, in this space of carved wood and ceremonial fire, culture is no longer something that needs to be reclaimed. It is simply lived. The house becomes a classroom, not in the institutional sense, but in the ancient one. Children learn how cedar bark is softened in river water, how goat wool is spun on the thigh, how every shape in the carvings carries a teaching. They don't sit at desks. They sit on woven mats beside grandmothers and aunties, absorbing knowledge in gesture, in rhythm, in silence. The clan house holds laughter, mourning, decision-making. It holds names. Each room is named for a crest, each beam a memorial, each post a witness. And in winter, when the wind cuts through the valley and the snow piles against the corners, the fire inside burns steady. The smoke curls upward, through the smoke hole, into the sky where the eagles still fly, watching, circling, remembering. One day, a group of university students visits the house. Some are Chilkat, some are not. Their guide, a young weaver named Tay, welcomes them not with facts, but with story. She walks them beneath the carved threshold and says, "Before you enter, remember, this is not a museum. This house has blood. It breathes. If you listen, it will speak to you." And it does. The students fall silent as the guide tells how the house was funded, not by grants alone, but by community. How every board was hewn by hand. How every carving had to be approved by the clan leaders. How no one moved forward without consensus, because in this space, decisions echo for generations. They learn that weddings take place here, that funerals are sung here, that apologies, real ones, the kind that carry weight, must be spoken here before the fire. before the ancestors. The guide pauses, points to a carved beam overhead. A raven, wings unfurled, mouth open. That's the storyteller, she says. He's listening. Be careful what you say. And the students laugh, but they glance upward, just to be sure. In a world of asphalt and steel, where speed outpaces memory and culture becomes content, the clan house is resistance. Not angry, not loud, but firm. Its walls say, we are not relics. Its fire says, we are not extinct. Its silence says, we are still telling the story. Tonight, in the deep dark of Alaska, the stars burn cold above the mountains. The river is quiet beneath a skin of ice. And in the longhouse, voices rise. Drums, song, footsteps on cedar. A child, barely 5, runs through the doorway, past the fire, and points to the crest on the wall. That's mine, she says. She is not wrong. The house belongs to her, and she belongs to it. The snow falls gently over the coastal hills, blanketing the moss-covered stones of an old Chilkat village site. The river runs quietly below, whispering around stones that once heard the voices of grandmothers, teaching children how to call a fish by name, how to thank a tree before taking its bark, how to speak to the land in the language of origin. That language was once nearly silenced, but now, beneath the weight of falling snow, it returns. A young boy steps into the clearing. He is no more than 12, bundled in a seal parka and gloves stitched with care. He carries no rifle, no phone, only a notepad and a recording device. His breath clouds before him. He kneels at a carved stone, half buried, and presses record. In Lingit, he speaks a name aloud, slowly, carefully. The syllables are round and rhythmic like the roll of a raven's call. He pauses, then repeats it, again and again. That name once lived on the wind here, on maps, on lips, until it was replaced, flattened into English, anglicized into a stranger's shape, marked down on surveyor maps as abandoned, vacant, unnamed. But the land remembers, and now, so do its people. Across the Tlingit homeland, and especially among the Chilkat, a quiet revolution unfolds. Not with protest signs or loud declarations, but with the return of names, place names, clan names, sacred object names, all once erased by colonization, boarding schools, and missionary policy, now being spoken again, written again, sung again. Each name given back is a thread rewoven into the Chilkat world. It starts with land. In the shadow of snow-dusted mountains near Klukwan, youth gather with elders for a naming walk. They carry hand-drawn maps, GPS tools, and old oral records. The elders stop often, pointing to a bend in the river, to a ridge scarred by fire, to a rock face etched with lichen. They speak the original names in Lingit, names that describe not just geography, but story. One elder gestures toward a cliffside. This was Dekinak, the place where the eagles mourned. Another lifts her hand toward the forest edge. And there, Yi Saxt, where the shadow of the wolf never leaves. The youth write the words down, record pronunciations, ask questions, learn. This is no symbolic exercise. These names are entered into official databases. They appear on tribal maps. Road signs are being updated, not erased, but doubled, side by side. English and Lingit, memory and modernity, because every name returned is a spirit unburied. Alongside this, another layer of memory comes home. Objects once stolen and displayed behind glass. At a museum in New York, a Chilkat blanket rests on a mannequin, its fringe stiff, its dyes faded, its spirit half asleep. It had been taken, like so many, by collectors who called themselves saviors, who believed they were preserving vanishing things while ignoring the people still living behind them. But now, something has shifted. The museum curator stands beside a delegation of Chilkat weavers and clan leaders. The room is quiet. No cameras, no press, just reverence. The curator steps forward, hands trembling, and speaks. We acknowledge this item was taken without consent. It was never ours. We are returning it home. There is no applause, only breath. One elder, his face lined with years, his voice raspy, approaches the robe. He lifts the fringe in his fingers, his lips trembling. I thought I would die before I saw this again, he whispers. The blanket is wrapped carefully, not in plastic or crate foam, but in traditional cloth. It will be flown, home, blessed, and displayed not behind glass, but in a clan house, alive again, carried in ceremony, singing once more through the hands of a dancer. And it is not alone. Ceremonial masks, clan hats, story knives, even bentwood boxes, some over 200 years old, are being returned, one at a time. Not as artifacts, but as family. This is called repatriation. But for the Chilkat, it is more than policy. It is healing. And healing too comes in the form of language. The Chilkat dialect of Lingit was once nearly extinguished, choked by residential schools, punished by forced English, made to seem backward. For decades, children were beaten for speaking it. Families stopped teaching it at home, not from shame, but from protection. But now, the language is returning, in nursery songs, in high school poetry slams, in mobile apps and grandmother-led Zoom classes, in every carved name on a trail sign, in the voice of a young father teaching his baby to say, "Yay our way, this is it." Language programs bloom across the region. In Haines, a language nest pairs elders with toddlers. The sounds of old lullabies echo through new walls. Gunal Cheish, thank you, Zana, my beloved. These words, once whispered in fear, now shouted in joy. At night, in homes warmed by wood stove and story, families gather to play Lingit word games. One mother grins as her daughter stumbles through a long sentence. You'll get it, she says. You already know it in your bones. Because language is not learned, it is remembered. Beyond the names and words, Chilkat youth are taking on stewardship. Not just of language, but of land. Old salmon streams, long choked with sediment and abandoned culverts, are being cleared. Youth groups hike upstream with shovels, mapping tools, and reverence. They dig by hand. They build beaver-style dams. They plant willow. They wade into icy current to place stones just right. This is not science instead of tradition. It is both. They call it indigenous science. One 17-year-old leader says it best. We're not restoring the land. The land is restoring us. We just have to help it remember. And it does. The salmon return. Silver flashes in clear pools. The eagles perch again along the banks. The children kneel beside spawning beds, pointing with glee as life begins again in the gravel. In that moment, the snow falls again. Light, software, a blessing. The trail where they walk now bears its old name once more, Tlakf An, the Always Village. Its sign, written in Lingit, gleams in the winter sun. Not a monument to what was lost, but a promise to what endures. And in the longhouses, where the fire burns low and the clan crests glow in ochre and black, an elder tells the children one more story. She speaks of the land before roads, of the songs before schools, of the names given back not just to places, but to people. She calls each child by their true name. They answer without hesitation. They know who they are. They always did. The river does not stop. Even in the coldest season, beneath a sheath of ice as thick as a man's thigh, the Chilkat River moves, quietly, steadily, with the memory of all that has passed over it. Glaciers feed it, rain fattens it, and time too bends itself to its rhythm. Here, water does not forget. The Chilkat River has always known the names of its people, long before survey lines, before cartographers flattened its wild curves onto paper maps, before gold rushers followed it upriver like a thread spun from greed. Before missionaries built wooden crosses on its banks, the river was there. And it is still here. You can hear it in the silence of winter, when ravens wheel in a pewter sky and the wind whips down from the mountains like a blade. You can hear it in the echo of paddles slicing through water as a dugout canoe glides past gravel bars. Its carved prow, painted with raven eyes, gazes ahead. Its passengers do not speak. They do not need to. The river speaks for them. Each year, at the turning of spring, the Chilkat come home to the water. From cities, from distant towns, from school dormitories and government jobs. They return to fish camps and river bends named generations ago. The tents go up, the smokehouses are readied, salmon traps are set. The river knows the rhythm. So do they. In one camp, an elder bends over a fire, her hands blackened with ash and fish oil. She threads salmon flesh onto skewers of alderwood, nodding gently to herself. Her granddaughter watches, eyes wide. The girl repeats the motions, a clumsy imitation, but learning. The elder smiles and says, "This is the same river your great-great-grandmother stood by. She dried fish here, she sang here, and when the storms came, she trusted the current." The girl listens. She hears more than words. She hears survival. Further downstream, a canoe carved from red cedar slices through the morning fog. Each paddle stroke is steady, measured. The men in the canoe wear no war paint, no costumes, just windbreakers and rubber boots. Their faces are serious, their silence sacred. In the lead canoe sits a youth, barely 18, his face taut with purpose. Around his neck hangs a raven pendant carved from bone. He has never fought a battle, but he carries the weight of generations on his shoulders. Today's journey is not about reenactment, it is about return. Each bend in the river marks a story. Each outcropping of stone has a name. Some are whispered in Lingit, others sung. Still others remembered only in gesture, like the way a paddle is lifted just so in salute as you pass beneath the glacier's breath. The Chilkat River is more than water. It is a storyline. The trading trails that once stretched inland like arteries of diplomacy began here. The grease trails, the salmon paths, the songlines, the place where clan leaders gathered in full regalia to speak terms with strangers, where Ooligan oil was loaded not just as commodity, but as cultural promise. The land has changed. Yes, loggers came, roads were built, the fishery collapsed, then rose again. Global warming eats at the glacier's foot. Still, the river flows. Still, the Chilkat endure. In a nearby school gymnasium, a drum circle gathers. Not for tourists, not for show, but for ceremony. The drum begins low, like thunder in a distant valley. A woman steps forward, her cloak trimmed in yellow cedar, her face painted with ochre and charcoal. Her voice rises, high, keening, ancient. She sings of the river, of her people's arrival, of the salmon's gift. Behind her, children follow in line, each draped in robes patterned with the raven and the wolf, the killer whale and the eagle. Some stumble, others laugh. A few sing boldly. No one is left behind. This is not a reenactment. This is not nostalgia. This is life. Later that evening, an interview is filmed along the riverbank. The sky is painted with the soft purples and oranges of a northern dusk. A community leader stands ankle-deep in the water, hands clasped behind her back. Her breath clouds before her. Her eyes never leave the current. "They tried to take it all," she says. "Our language, our robes, our children. But you see this?" She gestures toward the river, swelling from snowmelt. "This river never forgot our names. It carried them through the dark, and now we're speaking them again." Her voice breaks, but only slightly. We bend, we freeze, we flood, but we continue. That line becomes the refrain. Later, it will be chanted around fire circles, printed on signs outside tribal offices, etched into the cedar walls of new clan houses. We bend, we freeze, we flood, but we continue. because that is what the Chilkat have always done. Their story is not a closed book gathering dust on a forgotten shelf. It is a current, a flow, a motion. It is in the weaver's loom, threading cedar and wool into the curve of a killer whale. It is in the trail restorer's calloused hands, as he clears brush from the path once walked by his great-grandfather. It is in the language teacher's chalk, as she scrawls Gunalchesh across a blackboard, watching as her students repeat it, laughing, stumbling, remembering. It is in the hand-carved paddle that dips into the river each morning, moving with grace, with purpose, with belonging. And it is in the names, names spoken again, given back, carried forward. When the documentary ends, the camera does not fade to black. Instead, it lingers. The river remains, flowing, glinting with light, winding toward the sea. In the distance, an eagle rises, its wings cutting through the silence. And beneath it all, a voice, clear, calm, unbroken, whispers, "We are still the river." We always were, before the wind carried foreign voices across the Atlantic, before maps carved boundaries where rivers once flowed free, before treaties and betrayal, and the long centuries of forgetting. There were the people of the dawn. They rose with the tide. On the northeastern edge of the continent, where the sun first kisses the earth, the Passamaquoddy had lived for thousands of years, long before Maine had a name, long before any European foot pressed into the soil. To them, this land was not wilderness, it was kind. Every cedar grove, every stone-strewn beach, every silver-backed salmon weaving upriver held memory, story, spirit. The Passamaquoddy were never a people of palaces or empires. Their architecture rose from what the land gave. Birch bark stretched over arched saplings, sown with spruce roots and sealed tight with pine resin. These were not just shelters. They were living things, breathing in the morning mist, huddled beneath towering spruce, warmed by a central fire, and layered in centuries of memory. Each family moved with the rhythm of the seasons. In the warmth of summer, they gathered along the coast. The fog rolled in heavy some mornings, thick as wool, cloaking canoes that glided silently through inlets and tide-racked channels. The sea gave generously. Clams, urchins, flounder, mackerel, and eels pulled from tidal traps made of woven brush. Children learned early how to read the tide, when to wait, when to cast, when to pull. In the inland forests, winters pressed hard, but the people knew how to endure. Snowshoes made of ash and sinew carried them over deep drifts. They hunted moose and snowshoe hare. They fished through ice holes with lines carved from bone. Fire was life, and so was story. As wind howled outside their winter lodges, stories were passed from grandmother to child like a precious inheritance. Not just tales to entertain, but maps of how to live. The old ones spoke of Kaluskap, the culture hero who shaped the land and tamed the great beasts. They spoke of the giant frog that drank all the water, and how the people tricked it into releasing the rivers. Through the story, the Passamaquoddy learned humility, respect for the animal world, and the cost of greed. They did not write in books. They remembered in breath and voice, and they remembered well. Clan ties ran deep. Kinship was more than blood. It was shared song, shared hunt, shared fire. An injury to one was an injury to all. Leadership came not from brute strength, but from wisdom, generosity, and calm in crisis. The Sagamores, tribal leaders, were chosen not by birthright, but by how well they listened, and how little they spoke when the talking could wait. And always there was the canoe, carved from a single white pine or shaped from bark stretched over a cedar frame. The canoe was not a tool. It was an extension of the body. It moved where no horse could ride, over rivers, lakes, and coastal surf. It carried hunters, families, messengers, and warriors. It was a cradle of birth and a hearse of death. It carried lovers to each other and warriors to war. And always it returned to the water like a salmon going home. These waters, now named the Bay of Fundy, the St. Croix, the Passamaquoddy Bay, once held no borders, only tide and time. The people fished weirs constructed with careful stone placement, traps so ingeniously made that even after centuries, remnants still remain, hidden just below the low tide. In the dense interior forests, where light came in green shafts through hemlock and pine, the people moved in small bands. They gathered sweetgrass from marshes to weave baskets so tight they could hold water. They tapped maple trees for syrup long before colonists knew the taste. They spoke to plants before harvesting them. Everything taken from the land was offered back in ceremony, a pinch of tobacco, a whispered thanks. A pause, so the forest could remember who had come and why. Their language, soft, complex, deeply poetic, could describe the texture of snow, the direction of wind off the sea, the emotion in a bird's call. It was a language tied to place. To speak Passamaquoddy was to speak with the land, not about it. And the land listened. Generations lived and died in balance with this world. They knew famine, storm, grief. They knew the screams of a child lost to river current and the hunger of late winter when the traps came up empty. But they also knew joy. The crack of frozen lakes splitting under spring melt, the laughter of children sliding on snow-covered bark, the pride of a first moose taken with a hand-carved spear. Survival was never taken for granted, but it was never without beauty. Each dawn, as the sun rose over salt water, they greeted it with reverence. They were not just the people of the dawn because of where they lived, but because of how they lived, rising each day with new strength, new light, and an unbroken line to those who came before. But the light would not always be kind. Far beyond the horizon, sails were being raised, crosses were being kissed, maps were being drawn, and soon voices would arrive that did not listen. Axes would fall on sacred groves, fish traps would be claimed, children would be renamed, and the balance the Passamaquoddy had kept for so long would begin to falter. But that is not this chapter. Here, at the edge of the old world, before the ink of colonization stained the soil, we stand with the people of the dawn, not as relics, not as tragedy, but as brilliance, as architects of survival, as masters of bushcraft, diplomacy, and story. In this chapter of quiet fog and cedar smoke, we see a people who lived not apart from nature, but within it, who moved with the tides, who listened to the trees, who honored their dead by living well. The dawn rises red over the coast, and the story begins. The forest breathes in silence. Somewhere, a raven calls once, then disappears into the canopy. Beneath that canopy, and for centuries before the first gunshot echoed through the pines, 5 nations moved like water across a land they called home. The Micmac, the Maliseet, the Abenaki, the Penobscot, and the Passamaquoddy. 5 nations, 1 shield. This was not an empire drawn in blood or conquest, but a confederacy, the Wabanaki, meaning people of the Dawnland, an alliance of kinship, of trade, of survival. In a land where winter could freeze a man's breath mid-sentence, they understood that endurance was rarely a solitary endeavor. The land demanded unity, and so they answered. The Wabanaki Confederacy was a living net stretched across the northeastern woodlands, a web of rivers, trails, and trust. From the misty shores of Nova Scotia to the deep interiors of Vermont, messengers traveled on foot and by canoe, speaking dialects woven from the same linguistic roots, carrying council fires from village to village. There was no capital, no throne, but there was power, the kind rooted in shared memory and collective resistance. In a world before fences, boundaries were marked not by ink, but by story, and those stories were passed not in silence, but in ceremony, pipe, and promise. Then came the sails. At first they were distant, white ghosts on the sea, appearing with the rhythm of migrating whales. Traders, trappers, missionaries. Some brought iron tools and woven cloth, others brought musket barrels and Jesuit prayers. But all brought change. The French were the first to extend open hands to the Wabanaki. They came not only with goods, but with words that flattered: allies, partners, brothers. And so, for a time, the alliance worked. The Mi'kmaq and Maliseet welcomed French fur traders into their riverside camps. The Passamaquoddy shared routes through tangled birch groves and icy marshlands. The Penobscot showed them where the salmon ran strongest. In return, they received knives sharper than obsidian, beads the color of berries, wool warmer than deerskin. But the French also brought their god. Jesuit priests, wrapped in black robes, sat by the fire with sagamores and spoke of sin and salvation. They learned the languages, they baptized the children, and they watched. Always, they watched. Still, the Wabanaki did not yield. They listened, they adapted, but they did not forget who they were. Further south, the English did not come with open hands. They came with axes and surveys. Land was no longer shared. It was bought, fenced, renamed. English settlers poured into the valleys like spring melt, fast, cold, and unstoppable. They planted corn in stolen clearings and built meeting houses where sweat lodges once stood. The forests, once quiet with snowshoe whispers, now rang with hammer and saw. The Wabanaki Confederacy, sensing the storm, tightened its circle. The sagamores met in longhouses lit by pine-pitch torches. They passed the pipe and spoke in low tones. Messages were sent upriver. Canoes carved with urgency moved across lakes in the dead of night. And one truth became clear: unity was no longer a choice. It was the only hope. What followed was a series of resistance efforts that would test every branch of the Confederacy. The Beaver Wars, King Philip's War, the endless seesaw of French and English territorial bloodletting. And through it all, the Wabanaki stood not as pawns of empire, but as players, fierce, cunning, adaptable. They understood the value of terrain. The French may have built fortresses, but the Wabanaki had the forest. They knew the ravines where footsteps vanished, the bogs where soldiers sank, the rivers that could carry a message faster than any horse. Guerrilla tactics, ambushes at narrow crossings, silent strikes on supply lines. These became their language of survival. There are stories passed down of warriors vanishing into snowdrifts, covered in white birch bark, breathing through hollow reeds, waiting for hours to strike. Of women and children moving camps in complete silence, extinguishing fires with moss to hide the smoke. Of warriors marking enemy trails not with arrows, but by twisting the tops of young saplings, a signal only their brothers would understand. But for all their resistance, the weight of empire pressed harder. In time, treaties began to appear, slick with ink and heavy with deception. They were signed in languages foreign to the land, by hands that trembled under threat. The English, now rising in power, began to encroach deeper into Wabanaki territory, undermining alliances with gifts one year and betrayal the next. Yet even as land was taken, even as missionaries rewrote names and laws, the heart of the Confederacy beat on. The Wabanaki were not naive. They studied the ways of the newcomers. They learned English, sent their sons to colonial schools when they had to, but they also remembered. They kept their own counsels. They taught their children to trap, to track, to speak the old tongue by firelight when the soldiers had gone. They carved canoes in secret, just as their grandfathers had done. They buried their dead with songs the missionaries tried to silence, and always, always, they returned to the Confederacy. Not as a government, not as a nation-state, but as a sacred bond, a living memory that no treaty could kill. By the late 1700s, as revolution began to boil in Boston and Philadelphia, the Wabanaki watched with wary eyes. Some sided with the British, hoping they would slow the American settlers' hunger for land. Others tried to remain neutral. But neutrality had no place in a world built on possession. The forests that had once sustained them now shrank with each passing year. But the bond held, even into the 19th century, when most of New England was mapped, sold, and parceled out, when Passamaquoddy children were being taken into church-run schools, when the Sound of the fiddle had replaced the drum at too many gatherings. Even then, the Confederacy endured. Not in paperwork, but in story, in blood, in the lines that connect kin across rivers and time. A Penobscot elder once said, "We are trees with underground roots. The wind can break our branches, but it cannot reach what is below." The Wabanaki Confederacy is that root, unseen, often unspoken, but always there. A memory deeper than conquest, a shield of kinship that once spanned 1,000 miles of forest and still beats quietly in the hearts of its people. Because survival is not always resistance in battle. Sometimes it is knowing who you are long after the world has tried to forget. And the people of the dawn have never forgotten. The wind claws through the trees like a living thing, sharp, needling, bitter. In these forests, where the cold sets into bone and silence presses down like snowfall, survival is not about brute strength. It is about knowing the land, reading it like a story told in stone and frost. And the Passamaquoddy had been reading that story for over 10,000 winters. In a world without steel, electricity, or modern convenience, they carved out life with what the forest gave, and gave freely. Every tool in their hand was born not from conquest, but from deep understanding. It was not about mastering the wilderness. It was about moving with it, answering it, and surviving by its rules. Take the birch tree. To the untrained eye, it's just another pale-barked giant in the forest's choir. But to the Passamaquoddy, birch was life. It peeled like paper when warmed near fire, light enough to float on water, tough enough to hold fire's heat at bay. From its bark came containers for boiling stews, sheaths to wrap sacred medicines, scrolls for memory, and coverings for their homes. When sealed with spruce gum, it was as watertight as clay, but half the weight and double the resilience. They would harvest it with reverence. Never in winter, when the bark clung tight and tearing it meant scarring the tree. Instead, they waited for the sap's return in spring, when the bark slipped loose with a practiced twist. Tools were cut with blades chipped from riverstone or, later, bartered iron. The tree was thanked. A pinch of tobacco laid at its roots. Nothing was taken without ceremony, because to take without gratitude was to offend the spirit of the forest, and the forest never forgot. Bone was another treasure, scavenged from the remains of a successful hunt, boiled clean in snowmelt, scraped and shaped into delicate precision. Needles were whittled from bird bones, their eyes drilled with splinters of flint. Harpoon points were carved from moose jawbones, barbed like fishhooks and tougher than antler. Awls made from deer shins punched through hide with a twist of the wrist. Even a child's toy, like a spinning bone game used to learn hand-eye coordination, was carved from the leftovers of a meal. To the Passamaquoddy, there was no such thing as waste. Every sinew, every shell, every feather had a purpose. And then came the snow. By late November, the world transformed. Streams froze into silence. Animal trails vanished under drifts waist-deep. The wind could peel skin from a man's cheek in minutes. In these conditions, a single misstep could mean death. But the Passamaquoddy walked above it all. Snowshoes, woven from ash frames and gut lacing, spread weight like a deer's hoof across crusted powder. The frames were steamed and bent over fire-warmed molds, tied with rawhide until they dried into shape. They moved silently, carried hunters across ice-locked lakes, and left only a whisper of their passage. Some snowshoes were shaped like teardrops for maneuvering through thick woods. Others stretched long and thin for open country and deep snow. It wasn't enough to follow a trail. The Passamaquoddy learned to read the forest. A tuft of fur on bark meant a fleeing snowshoe hare. Scratches in fresh snow spoke of porcupine. Bent twigs pointed the way to moose bedding down in low thickets. Hunting was not just about skill. It was about timing. Moose were easiest to track in heavy snow, when their weight slowed them. Porcupines were easy prey in late winter, when hunger weakened their defenses. Even beaver could be caught by setting traps near half-chewed saplings and listening for the cracking of ice. And what could not be hunted was gathered. Sweetgrass, the sacred braid, was collected in summer marshlands where mosquitoes swarmed so thick the air itself seemed to hum. Women waded waist-deep, careful not to damage the roots. They plucked only what was needed, then laid it in sun-warmed bundles to dry. Later, it would be braided into long coils, used to bind, to cleanse, to offer thanks. The smell of it, sweet, earthy, warm, lingered through winter lodges like a memory of sunlit days. Ash trees were pounded to fibers for basket making. The trunks were cut, split, then pounded rhythmically with wooden mallets. The fibers separated like ribbons, strong, flexible, ready to be woven. With those strips, they made baskets tough enough to carry stones or hold boiling rocks without bursting. Some were plain and practical. Others carried intricate patterns, taught from mother to daughter, each design speaking of family, place, and spirit. A basket could last a lifetime, then be passed down again. But of all tools the Passamaquoddy crafted, none carried more meaning than the canoe. Light enough for a man to carry, strong enough to ride a storm-swollen river, the birch bark canoe was a masterpiece of engineering. Its frame was cedar, resilient, flexible, rot-resistant. The ribs were steamed and shaped, lashed with spruce root, and stitched with care. The bark, peeled from a single massive birch if possible, was sewn like hide and sealed with pine pitch, melted over coals. Each canoe took weeks to building. A single mistake, a loose seam, a cracked rib, could mean death on cold, fast-moving water. But in the right hands, it was a lifeline. It carried families to summer fishing grounds. It ferried warriors through back channels. It brought traders to rendezvous points deep in the interior. And sometimes, it carried the dead, lashed to poles, floated downriver with songs and smoke trailing behind. Rivers were not obstacles. They were roads, highways of trade, communication, migration. The Passamaquoddy mapped them not with parchment, but in memory. They knew where the currents shifted, where to portage, where to fish, where to hide. A canoe could be hidden beneath reeds or flipped and used as a shelter. In the war seasons, warriors traveled by night, paddles muffled with sealskin, breath held as they slid past enemy outposts like shadows. Even the fire had its tools, stone drills to spark flame on dry punk, tinder pouches sewn from otter skin, embers carried in mossy bundles on long journeys. The Passamaquoddy could light fire in freezing rain, feed it with bark peeled from dead trees, coax it alive with breath and patience. Fire was not just warmth, it was signal, ceremony, protection, and life. These tools, crafted in silence, shaped by instinct, passed down by hand, were more than implements. They were identity. A snowshoe laced in a grandmother's pattern, a basket woven in the clan's spiral, a canoe that bore a father's carved mark. These things were sacred, not because they were beautiful, but because they worked, because they endured, because they were made to do one thing: keep the people alive. And for a long time, they did. But even the best tools cannot stop the tide. The guns came next, the iron pots, the wool blankets that never quite dried, and with them, dependency. Slowly, surely, the old tools were replaced. The birch bark faded. The bone knives dulled and were forgotten. Some baskets were sold to tourists. Some canoes rotted under tarps, unused. But some remained. In backwoods workshops, under low tin roofs, the old ways returned. Ash logs are pounded again. Bark is peeled from trees in spring. Grandmothers teach weaving with fingers wrinkled by time. A boy learns to bend cedar by steam. A girl watches her uncle sew birch bark with root thread. And somewhere, deep in the northern forest, a fire crackles as snow falls softly, and a flint strikes spark to punk. The edge world still lives, and the tools still remember, because the forest may change, but it never forgets those who once knew how to live with it. The strangers did not arrive with war cries. They came quietly, their ships gliding like shadows across the morning tide. sails catching the sun like wings. To the Passamaquoddy, watching from the cedar-lined shores, they were first a curiosity, figures of wood and wool, their voices guttural, their eyes pale like fish bellies. The year was uncertain. Dates had little meaning to a people, who marked time by tides and the turning of leaves. But what is remembered, what could not be forgotten, was how the forest changed when the strangers came. At first, it was the French. They brought beads the color of fireberries, copper kettles that steamed in the morning cold, steel knives that could split bone like a raven's beak. Their faces were tired, half-starved, their mouths twisted in hunger for furs, for trade, for the warmth of alliance. They spoke of peace, of friendship. They offered gifts, musket balls, mirrors, iron awls that cut bark clean. The Passamaquoddy listened, watched, judged. Sagamores debated by firelight. Could these men be trusted? Could trade be balanced? Would alliance bring strength, or entangle them in the wars of ghosts? In time, they accepted the French with caution, not as brothers, but as tools. Tools could be useful, and tools could be discarded. For a season, peace held. Beaver pelts flowed from forest to ship in exchange for gunpowder, cloth, tobacco. Jesuit missionaries followed, men in black robes with crucifixes hanging heavy around their necks. They baptized children, built small chapels from pine, and told stories of a single God who demanded obedience. Some listened, some did not. The spirits of the forest were old, older than this God of nailed hands and burning books. But the true sickness came not in scripture, but in breath. The first fever arrived in late summer. A child grew warm, then cold, then still, then another, then 20, then 50. Coughs that choked lungs into silence, rashes that burned across skin like wildfire. The healers tried everything: cedar smoke, spruce tea, river ice pressed to swollen throats. But nothing worked. The dead were wrapped in birch bark, buried deep in frost-hardened soil, their names spoken in trembling voices. By winter's end, entire villages lay silent, fires unlit, tools rusting, songs forgotten. It was smallpox, or measles, or influenza. Names did not matter, only the silence remained. Some say a third of the people vanished, others say half. Stories speak of mothers placing cold infants into the river so their spirits could return to the ancestors. The Passamaquoddy had survived hunger, cold, war. But this was different. There was no enemy to fight, only air, only breath. And yet, they endured. The next spring, those who remained gathered what they could, cleaned the old lodges, whispered prayers into the soil, and began again. Survival was not a choice. It was a duty. To the ancestors, to the land, to the children still unborn. But the strangers did not stop. They returned, more of them now. Not just French. English ships appeared, faster and better armed, their flags flapping like the wings of carrion crows. The English did not speak of alliance. They spoke of purchase, of division, of ownership. They brought paper maps drawn by men who had never felt a Maine winter, who measured rivers with rulers and forests with greed. The French had come to trade. The English came to stay. They built wooden forts with cannons that watched the sea. They carved roads through sacred hunting trails, cut timber from burial grounds, and fenced land that had never known such insult. They renamed rivers with foreign syllables and called the people savages when they pushed back. The Passamaquoddy were caught in the middle, between empires, between musket fire and diplomacy. The French courted them still, offering guns, urging raids against the English. The English responded with bounties, scalp prices placed on Passamaquoddy heads, regardless of age, regardless of guilt. A child's scalp could fetch £5 sterling, a warrior's 20. Trust turned brittle. The alliances frayed. In 1724, the burning of Norridgewock, a village of Wabanaki allies, shocked the northeast. English soldiers stormed the settlement, slaughtering men, women, even Father Sebastian Rao, a Jesuit priest who had lived among the people for decades. His blood mingled with the ashes of the Longhouse. To the Passamaquoddy, it was a sign. If the English would kill even their own priest for loyalty to native people, then no one was safe. And yet, for all the blood, the borders kept shifting. Maps redrawn after every treaty. Treaty of Utrecht, Treaty of Paris, Treaty of who remembers what. Each new agreement inked in a language the Passamaquoddy did not speak, signed by men who did not bleed in these woods. Every treaty a promise, every promise a trap. A warrior named Madabi once said, "The treaties are like the wind. You see them on paper, but you cannot hold them. And when the wind changes, so do the words." By the mid-1700s, the Passamaquoddy knew that paper could not be trusted, nor could the flags of foreign nations. Survival now meant strategy. They sent delegations to Montreal and Boston, listened carefully, never said too much. They played the empires against each other, took what they could in trade, and always kept their own counsel. But the land slipped away. A boundary drawn on a British map cut through the heart of their territory. Suddenly, the river that had always been theirs was discovered and claimed. Hunting grounds became no man's lands. Sacred islands were granted to colonial generals as rewards for bloodshed. Even the trees began to vanish. White pine harvested for British masts, floated downriver to feed a navy the Passamaquoddy would never see. And so, the forest changed. The calls of loon and wolf were drowned by axes, the scent of pine sap replaced by gunpowder and smoke. Canoes were challenged by schooners. Snowshoe trails gave way to rutted wagon roads. And still, the people endured, because endurance was carved into their bones. When land was taken, they moved deeper into the woods. When rivers were closed, they followed tributaries the English could not find. When their language was outlawed in schools, they whispered it by firelight, teaching children to count by the tides, not the bells of distant church towers. They did not vanish. They adapted, not out of weakness, but because survival was not resistance for its own sake. It was the preservation of memory, of spirit, of place. To this day, there are stones along the riverbanks carved with names in Passamaquoddy syllables, markers of burial grounds, prayer sites, council fires long gone. And though many of those places have been renamed, mapped over, paved across, the land remembers. So do the people. Because the arrival of strangers did not end the story. It changed its shape, but the thread remained unbroken, not because of treaties, or alliances, or mercy, but because when the dawn returned each morning, the Passamaquoddy was still there, watching, waiting, remembering, and still surviving. The wind whispered through the pines with a voice older than empires. In the stillness of dawn, it carried the scent of wood smoke, the iron tang of blood, and the rustle of bodies moving low through the underbrush. This was not the silence of peace. It was the silence before war. By 1754, the great powers of Europe had dragged their rivalries into the forests of the New World. France and Britain, locked in a centuries-old struggle, now bled across 1,000 miles of wilderness. Their quarrel over borders, fur, and dominion would come to be known as the 7 Years' War. Though here, among the rivers and pine barrens of the Northeast, it wore another name, the French and Indian War. But for the Passamaquoddy, it was never their war. It was survival, sharpened into a blade. For decades, the Passamaquoddy had walked a knife's edge between French alliance and English aggression. The French spoke in softer tones, offered Catholic crosses and gunpowder. They did not build many towns, did not fence much land. They hunted beaver, not territory. The English, by contrast, came with plows, surveys, and soldiers. They spoke of ownership. They built forts near ancient fishing grounds, carved roads through burial forests, renamed rivers that had never asked for it. So when war came, the decision was not one of loyalty, it was necessity. The Passamaquoddy stood with the French, and the British would never forgive them. The first raids came in the spring, when ice still clung to the riverbanks like dying breath. A Passamaquoddy war party, no more than a dozen men, slipped across the St. John River in silence. Their canoes, bark-stitched and pine-sealed, vanished into cattails and mist. They moved on snowshoes across half-melted drifts, guided by ravens and memory. Their target was a British outpost, newly built, poorly guarded, a symbol more than a fortress. They struck before the morning fire was lit. Arrows flew first, silent, unseen. Then the muskets barked. Chaos bloomed. By the time the smoke cleared, the redcoats lay dead or fleeing, their supplies scattered, their powder wet. The Passamaquoddy did not linger. They vanished into the trees before the next sunrise. It was not conquest. It was a message. But messages have consequences. By summer, British reprisals swept down like a storm. They came in columns, soldiers in wool coats, sweating through dense woods, led by scouts who barely understood the land they marched through. Their muskets rusted in the rain. Their boots sank into marshes they couldn't map. But they had numbers and orders. They struck Wabanaki villages in the night, burned lodges, cut down old men who couldn't flee, took women as captives, children as leverage. One elder, named Sosep, was bound and marched for 3 days to a British fort where he was offered protection in exchange for information. He spat in their faces, even as the boots crushed his ribs. Entire bands scattered into the deep woods, leaving only ash behind. But the wilderness was not enemy terrain. It was home. The Passamaquoddy retreated not in panic, but with purpose. They followed ancient trails, paths invisible to English eyes, narrow footpaths along deer runs, river bends and granite ridges. Women carried infants swaddled in woven moss, their steps quick but quiet. Elders moved with walking sticks carved generations before. Canoes, hidden beneath thickets, were lifted and packed in silence. In a single night, entire families could vanish, leaving behind only footprints that melted by morning. The forest became their fortress. Traps were laid along likely pursuit routes, snares not just for game, but for men. Small deadfalls triggered by weight, concealed pits, signal stones left near creeks that told those who could read them. Danger here. Go around. They lived off the land. Smoked fish along remote creeks, gathered wild leeks and fiddleheads, trapped beaver and muskrat. They boiled birch bark for medicine, chewed pine resin to fight infection. Their fires were made low, hidden under lean-tos, the smoke buried in tree cover. But even sanctuary cannot hold forever. By 1758, British pressure intensified. Forts rose like tumours across the landscape. Fort Halifax, Fort Pownal, Fort Frederick, each one a blade driven deeper into Wabanaki territory. The British governor of Massachusetts issued a new bounty, £50 for the scalp of any hostile Indian male, 30 for women, even less for children. It was not war. It was extermination masked in law. The French, stretched thin and reeling, could offer only so much. Their forts in Acadia were under siege. Their commanders begged for aid from Quebec. Their priests held services in Latin for people whose names they could barely pronounce. Yet still, the Passamaquoddy fought. Small skirmishes lit the forests, ambushes at stream crossings, raids on logging camps, the occasional bold strike on British blockhouses. One Passamaquoddy hunter, Ian, is said to have stalked a British detachment for 2 days through sleet and wind, waiting for them to make camp near a clearing. At dusk, he crept close enough to cut the laces on their powder bags. The next morning, when they tried to fire, nothing. By nightfall, the woods swallowed them whole. But for every success, there was cost. Children grew up in hiding. Ceremonies were whispered. Food ran thin. A winter came, harder than any in memory, and 2 villages starved before the spring thaw. And then, in 1760, the French surrendered. The Treaty of Paris, signed with ink and arrogance, ceded everything: land, rivers, lives. France relinquished its claim to the northeast, but France had no right to give it away. It had never belonged to them. For the Passamaquoddy, the war did not end. It simply changed shape. Now, with French power gone, British rule swept in like floodwaters. Soldiers arrived with orders to clear native settlements. Missionaries returned with promises of civilization. Maps were redrawn again. Only this time, the Passamaquoddy weren't even named. But they endured. In the deep woods, old ways were kept. Canoes still carved from cedar. Birch bark still gathered in spring. Snowshoes still woven. Language still spoken by the fire. Children taught not to forget, not to surrender. A Wabanaki elder, speaking a century later, said, "They tried to take the land, they took the soil, but they could not take the pines, and the pines remember us." And they do. Every scar in bark where traps once hung, every flat rock along a stream where fish were cleaned, every bend in the trail where warriors once crouched in the rain, waiting. These are the battlefields history books do not mark. But the forest knows, the wind remembers. Because though the Passamaquoddy did not win the war, not in the way nations measure victory, they survived it. Not with armies, but with knowledge, with silence, with stubborn, defiant existence. They vanished into the pines when hunted, returned when forgotten, and when the sun rose again over the frost-hung rivers of Maine, the people of the dawn were still there. The war drums had faded, the musket fire quieted, but peace never came. What arrived instead was parchment, inked promises penned by men in distant cities, men who had never set foot on the rock-strewn shores of Passamaquoddy Bay. Their weapons were no longer flint and steel. They were pens, seals, words spoken in English and Latin and legal tongues older than the soil itself. This was not the peace the Passamaquoddy had fought to protect. It was surrender disguised as signature, and it began with treaties written to vanish. The first came in 1794, delivered by men with polished boots and blank eyes, accompanied by translators who only half understood the words they were asked to explain. The treaty promised hunting rights, promised protection, promised land in perpetuity, a phrase that seemed firm but would rot with time. The Passamaquoddy agreed, cautiously, in good faith. They marked the paper with symbols instead of names, sacred animals, clan signs, the quiet strength of ancestors. But the treaty they signed was not the treaty recorded. Lines were added, clauses rewritten, boundaries redrawn after the fact. The land granted to them, thousands of acres, was suddenly dotted with English settlements, cleared by surveyors who claimed no record of native ownership. The land began to disappear, not in battle, but in silence. One by one, rivers once filled with salmon were dammed. Shores where canoes had launched for generations were sold to timber companies. Burial grounds became hayfields. Sugar maples were tapped not by families gathering spring syrup, but by hired crews with steel spiles and horse-drawn wagons. The Passamaquoddy were told to be thankful, that they had been given what had always been theirs. In 1820, when Maine separated from Massachusetts and became its own state, a new wave of treaties arrived. But these were not mutual agreements. They were edicts, decrees made without consultation. The state began appointing Indian agents, white men with unchecked authority over tribal affairs. These agents decided how funds were used, who received medical care, which children were sent to school. Often they skimmed money from the government payments. Sometimes they stole outright. One such agent, Thomas McGaw, was caught selling off tribal land parcels to settlers while pocketing the revenue. When questioned, he simply claimed the tribe lacked the capacity to manage their own affairs. There was no punishment. He retired with honors. To the state, the Passamaquoddy were not citizens. They were wards, not sovereign, not partners, subjects, and yet they resisted. Elders wrote letters, in slow, careful English, to governors, senators, even the president. They demanded their rights, cited treaty language, quoted lines that promised land forever. Some walked for days to attend legislative sessions in Augusta, standing silently in the gallery while their futures were debated by strangers, but the words always returned. No record, no proof, no enforcement. One chief, Joseph Nicholas, wrote in 1841, "We do not understand how paper can speak louder than memory. Our grandfathers buried their fathers beneath these trees. Must we now bury their memory beneath your courts?" Still, the land slipped away. A particularly cruel deception came in 1852, when the state claimed the tribe had voluntarily sold 10,000 acres of their reservation land. No member of the Passamaquoddy recalled the meeting. No one remembered a vote. But the sale was recorded, notarized, and enforced. By the turn of the 20th century, what had once been a vast homeland was reduced to small reservations, Pleasant Point and Indian Township, isolated, underfunded, neglected. The people who had once moved with the seasons, from coastal islands to inland hunting grounds, were now penned in by lines on a map they did not draw. And still, the treaties were invoked. School children were told they must speak English, that their language was barbaric, that the old ways had no place in a modern world. Many were sent to boarding schools far from home, some in Massachusetts, others as far as Pennsylvania. There, their braids were cut, their names replaced, their prayers silenced. A woman named Mary Frances remembered decades later being beaten for speaking Passamaquoddy to her sister at night. She said, "I was 9 years old. I had never seen a belt before. When it hit my skin, I thought I would die. But worse was the silence after, when I forgot how to say my grandmother's name." The treaties had promised protection. What they delivered was erasure. Even into the 1970s, the Passamaquoddy were denied the right to vote in Maine elections. Roads to their communities were left unpaved. Homes had no plumbing. Hospitals turned them away. And always, when they raised protest, the answer came cold. You are not a nation. You are not sovereign. You have no standing in the eyes of the law. But what the law forgot, the people remembered. Old stories were told again, quietly at first, then louder. Birchbark scrolls were unrolled. Songs once forbidden were sung beneath starlit skies. Youth councils formed. Language revitalization began. And amid the renewal came a firestorm. In 1972, armed with a team of young lawyers, Passamaquoddy leaders filed suit against the United States government. They claimed that over 300,000 acres of tribal land had been taken in violation of treaties. Treaties never nullified, never honored. The government laughed until they read the case and realized the treaties, long thought forgotten, were still binding, still federal, still law. The case, known as Joint Tribal Council of the Passamaquoddy Tribe versus Morton, set fire to the legal landscape. It acknowledged, for the first time in generations, that the federal government had a trust responsibility to the tribe, that those old treaties, those ghost documents inked and ignored, still mattered. In 1980, after years of litigation, the Maine Indian Claims Settlement Act awarded the Passamaquoddy $81.5 million. Land could be repurchased, programs rebuilt, voices restored. But the damage was not undone. The original homeland could not be fully reclaimed. Lost elders could not be resurrected. Languages, once near extinction, now hung on by syllables and song. And even today, battles remain over water rights, sovereignty, jurisdiction, because the treaties never stopped haunting the land. they simply changed form. What began as deception became structure. What was taken with lies now hides behind bureaucracy. And yet, the Passamaquoddy remain. Because treaties may be ghost-written, but memory is not. The wind still moves through the pines at Pleasant Point. Children learn the old words again, one breath at a time. Drums still echo across the river. And when the elders speak, they do not speak in the past tense. They say, "We are still here," and the land listens. The tide rolls in without asking permission. On the salt-streaked edges of eastern Maine, the Passamaquoddy watched the sea not as conquerors, but as survivors. By the mid-19th century, their world had been carved down to fragments. Reservations hemmed by survey lines, saltwater inlets where they were allowed to remain not because of generosity, but because no one else wanted the cold wind and stony soil. They were no longer warriors in the eyes of the nation. They were seen as relics, artifacts of a vanishing past. But relics don't fish at 4 in the morning. Relics don't paddle out into black seas to lay eel traps, hoping the catch will buy winter firewood. Relics don't survive. The 1800s had arrived with promises of civilization. Churches had been built near tribal settlements, and missionaries, mostly Protestant and Catholic, preached a new salvation. Save their souls, the government instructed. Civilize their minds. Break the old ways. For many Passamaquoddy children, this began with schoolhouses built not to teach, but to erase. At Indian Township and other settlements, young boys and girls were lined up, inspected, and stripped of more than just their traditional clothing. Braids were sheared with dull scissors. Birchbark toys confiscated. Names replaced with English ones easier for teachers to pronounce. They were forbidden to speak their language, even during recess, even when crying for their mothers. A girl named Matilda Tomar recalled being slapped across the face for saying the word nokomis, grandmother. "I didn't know how to cry in English," she said, "so I stopped crying altogether." These were the saltwater exiles, not exiled by a single event, but by slow erosion. Not cast out with spears, but pushed aside with rules. The government called them civilized Indians now. But there was no citizenship, no legal standing, no vote. They were labeled as wards of the state, expected to survive on rations, Christianity, and obedience. What they got was hunger. The reservations, Pleasant Point on the coast, Indian Township deeper inland, offered little protection from winter. Wooden houses built by tribal hands were left without funding for repairs. Firewood ran out before the snow did. Infant mortality climbed. Malnutrition left elders toothless by 40. So the Passamaquoddy adapted. Again. Fishing, which had always been sacred, became survival. Families woke before dawn to dig clams at low tide. Lobster traps, bent and baited by hand, were lowered into churning waters. Men hunted seal in the colder seasons, sometimes paddling canoes past the edge of visibility. A harpoon cast wrong could mean death. One slip, and the sea did not forgive. But the water gave, if asked respectfully. Women made baskets, ash pounded, hand-woven, dyed with berries and bark. Some bore simple spirals, others intricate patterns passed down through generations. They sold them at roadside markets or to wealthy tourists who admired Indian handiwork, but never thought to ask where the designs came from. Each sale was an act of resistance. Each basket a story held in reeds and silence. The economy offered little else. Many Passamaquoddy men left during the warmer months to work as seasonal laborers, cutting timber in northern Maine, picking blueberries, building roads. Wages were meager, sometimes paid in tobacco or whiskey. They returned home with cracked hands, worn boots, and stories of humiliation. There was one man, Peter Neptune, who worked at a mill in Bangor during the 1870s. The foreman called him Joe because Peter was too hard to remember. He was not allowed to eat with the white workers. He slept in a tool shed behind the sawdust piles. At night, he carved tiny canoes out of pine scraps and whispered old songs his father had taught him. He once told his grandson, they couldn't understand the words, so they thought they had no meaning, but every song was a map, a prayer, a memory. That's how the culture survived, in fragments, in hiding. The ceremonies, once danced openly in forest clearings, moved indoors, smudge bowls lit in secret, songs hummed instead of chanted, stories passed at night by grandmothers too old to care who disapproved. Language became rebellion. Children were taught the old words not in classrooms, but by firelight, during clam bakes, during snowshoe walks. Words for rain, for hunger, for forgiveness. Words that could not be bought or taxed or rewritten. There was no official census for grief, no ledger tracking the erosion of a people's self-worth, but you could see it in the eyes of the elders, how they looked at the horizon as if measuring how far they'd already been pushed. And yet, they endured. Some became preachers themselves, blending Christianity with old beliefs. Others became translators, fluent in English, but unbroken in identity. And some simply held on, stubborn, quiet, present. In the late 1800s, a census taker asked a Passamaquoddy elder if he was still Indian. The old man stared at him for a long time, then pointed to the ground. "This dirt," he said, "still Passamaquoddy?" The man nodded. "Then so am I." The land remembered, even when the world tried to forget. Along the coast, the gulls still cried out in ancient rhythm. The tides still whispered stories of canoes and seal hunts and lovers who vanished into the fog. Even the wind, salt thick and cold, seemed to carry the voices of those who came before. By 1900, the population had shrunk, but it had not disappeared. The US Census listed only a few hundred Passamaquoddy, spread thin across harsh land, forgotten by the bureaucracy that claimed to protect them. But numbers can't measure resolve. Every child born was a declaration. Every ceremony held was defiance. Every word spoken in Passamaquoddy was a refusal to be erased. The 19th century had offered nothing but erasure. But the Passamaquoddy had given it something else: survival. Not just survival of flesh, but of meaning, of memory, of roots too deep to be seen by any map. And when the new century dawned, it carried with it a strange kind of silence, not defeat, a gathering. Because something was coming, something long overdue, and the saltwater exiles had never stopped listening for the tide to change. They say the wind that moves through the birch trees carries memory. In the quiet corners of the Passamaquoddy world, between tidal estuaries and moss-hung pine groves, there were those who refused to forget. Not warriors in the traditional sense, not chiefs or treaty signers, but guardians of another kind of knowledge. The ones who remembered the old ways when forgetting would have been easier. The medicine keepers, the memory holders. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, when federal agents came with clipboards and doctrines, and missionaries preached salvation through silence, these quiet rebels held fast to the invisible scaffolding of Passamaquoddy life. They held on to the cedar smoke, the bitter root teas, the lullabies that once floated through bark lodges under frost-lit moons. They held on, even when speaking the language brought punishment, even when herbal cures were mocked as superstition, even when the world called them vanishing. At the heart of it were the women, the grandmothers with knotted hands and deep eyes, who brewed teas from sweet flag and goldenrod, who burned white cedar in turtle shell bowls to cleanse a home after a death, who whispered stories to children too young to know they were being taught how to survive in a world that wanted them to disappear. One of them was known as Auntie Molly, never married, never rich, but always known. She lived in a cedar-shingled cabin on the edge of Indian Township in the early 1900s, surrounded by rows of drying herbs tied in bundles above her windows. Wintergreen, yarrow, boneset. She carried a pouch of tobacco wherever she went, not to smoke, but to offer to the earth before gathering medicine. Her cures were quiet things: a poultice for a burn, a tea to bring down fever, a chant to call a spirit back to a grieving child. People said she could tell if a storm was coming by how the alder leaves curled, that she spoke to the dead in dreams and came back with answers. Even the missionaries who disapproved of her practices came to her for help when their children were sick, because her knowledge worked. But it wasn't just about curing illness. It was about keeping the world whole, thread by thread. In every Passamaquoddy village, there was someone like her. A singer who knew the old sweat lodge songs. A man who could build a birch bark canoe without ever touching a blueprint. A woman who knew which mushroom was food and which one was death. This was bushcraft, not of blade and fire, but of spirit and story. The medicine of remembering. They worked in the shadows of forced assimilation. The boarding schools, the Indian agents, the poverty, all aimed to strip away the old layers. But these keepers knew that survival didn't only happen with food or shelter. It happened with identity, with belonging. So they hid the songs inside lullabies, hid the stories in basket patterns, taught children the old names for plants while pretending it was just a game. Language became a lifeline. Ritual became refuge. And some carried memories so deep, they weren't even sure where the story ended and the spirit began. A healer named Noel Sabatis once told a story passed to him through 5 generations. It was about a young girl who fell sick during a winter when the snow piled to the roofline and no one had meat for days. Her breath rattled like dry pine needles. The people thought she would die, but an old man, nearly blind, carved a spoon from the heartwood of black ash and filled it with a broth made from the last sliver of dried moose meat, cedar tips, and spruce gum. He fed her one sip at a time, singing a song that hadn't been heard in 70 winters. She lived. Noel said, the song didn't heal her. The remembering did. That's how it worked. Memory was the medicine, and medicine was everywhere. The forest was not a place of fear. It was a pharmacy. Bear root for pain, sweet fern for upset stomach, wild mint to cool the blood. And every gathering began the same way, with tobacco, with thanks, with silence, because taking from the land required permission. That was the difference between knowledge and wisdom. Even in the darkest decades, when traditional ceremonies were illegal under federal law, sweat lodges were dug in secret, fires lit behind wood piles, cedar boughs soaked in water carried steam up into the dark, where songs echoed off stone. No English was spoken in those moments, no world outside the dome. And in that heat, memory came back. Some younger people ran from it, ashamed. They'd been taught to see it as backward, primitive, but the old ones waited, quiet, patient, because they knew the fire always calls you back when the world turns cold. By the mid-20th century, a shift began. Slow, like spring thaw under old ice. Young Passamaquoddy activists started recording the elders' songs. Linguists partnered with tribes to build the first written forms of the language. Children began asking their grandparents how to say river, tree, dream. And the memory holders began to speak louder, still humble, still cautious, but no longer in hiding. A woman named Eleanor Sock became one of the first public language teachers at Pleasant Point. Her lessons weren't just phonetics, they were ceremonies. Every verb taught was rooted in land, every noun connected to kinship. She once said, "When we teach a child the word for water, we teach them who they are. Because our language doesn't describe water, it sings it." Modern medicine was welcomed. Antibiotics, vaccines, surgeries. But it was never meant to replace what was sacred. Cedar still burned in hospital rooms. Tea was still offered before surgery. Stories were still told to patients who couldn't sleep, not just for comfort, but to remind the spirit it belonged in the body. Because illness was never just in the flesh. It could hide in memory, in trauma, in forgetting. And so the medicine keepers kept teaching. Their tools were not scalpels or stethoscopes. but stories, songs, smoke, and silence. Their clinics were not built from glass and steel, but forest clearings and kitchen tables. Their training did not come from universities, but from lineage, from loss, from love. And even now, in the 21st century, when the world hums with screens and concrete, their medicine remains. Every time a child plants sweetgrass in a school garden, every time a grandmother boils cedar in her kitchen, every time someone prays in a language almost lost, the healing continues. Because survival is more than just enduring. It is remembering, and the Passamaquoddy remember. The wind that had once carried wailing songs across the waters of Passamaquoddy Bay was still. But deep beneath that silence, something ancient stirred. For generations, the story had been whispered, not in courts or newspapers, but around kitchen tables, in canoes, behind schoolhouses. The story of stolen land, of broken treaties, of promises made on paper that vanished like smoke in the white man's fire. And though the world had declared them forgotten, the Passamaquoddy had been waiting for a moment to rise. That moment came in the 1970s, not with war paint or arrows, but with legal briefs and tribal council meetings, not on horseback, but in conference rooms beneath humming fluorescents. A new kind of warrior stepped forward, armed with history, driven by justice. His name was Tom Chireen. A young lawyer from Yale, barely into his 30s, Chireen arrived in Indian Township with a question few outsiders dared ask. What if the treaties were still valid? What if, despite the centuries of erasure, the Passamaquoddy had never legally ceded their land? No one had ever posed that question in a court of law, until now. Chireen met with elders, reviewed documents buried in federal archives, listened to stories passed through bloodlines instead of textbooks. The treaties of 1794, 1818, and 1833 were still intact under federal law, he argued. Never nullified, never overturned, merely ignored. And the US government had a binding trust responsibility to honor them. In the fall of 1972, with the support of the Joint Tribal Council, the Passamaquoddy and Penobscot tribes filed what would become one of the largest native land claims in US history. The suit asserted that roughly 60% of the state of Maine, over 12 million acres, had been taken illegally, without compensation, and in violation of federal law. At first, the nation laughed. Editorials called it absurd. Politicians rolled their eyes. Local newspapers mocked the idea that a tribe, long pushed to the margins, could suddenly lay claim to vast swathes of forest, towns, rivers, even state highways. But the tribes did not flinch. This was not a stunt. It was not a symbol. It was a reckoning. The case crawled forward, inch by inch, stone by stone. Documents were unearthed. Letters, journals, transaction records, maps with hand-drawn lines made by white men who had known full well that treaties were being violated. The evidence mounted like a storm. Some elders, like Mary Sabates and John Dana, testified not with bitterness, but with clarity. They spoke of land taken without consent, of families relocated by threats or starvation. They remembered names, dates, rivers. They did not need law books. They had memory. One elder, when asked what the land meant to him, paused for a long moment before saying, "It is not mine. It is me." The court listened, and slowly the tide began to turn. In 1975, a federal judge ruled that the tribe's case had standing. That meant it could proceed, opening the door to a legal earthquake. Now Maine was paying attention. Lumber companies panicked. Homeowners feared eviction. The governor's office went into crisis mode. Federal negotiators stepped in, and what followed was 5 years of fierce bargaining. The tribes knew they could not reclaim every acre. Too much had changed. Too many towns and roads built. Too many settlers who had never known their homes were on stolen ground. But what they could reclaim, what they demanded, was dignity. recognition, and a future that did not depend on charity. The Passamaquoddy insisted on sovereignty, on land, on self-governance. They wanted the right to decide what happened in their communities without interference, without oversight, without the slow choke of bureaucratic neglect. Tension hung over every meeting. Some state officials urged delay, hoping the tribes would fold under pressure, but they didn't. They never had. And then, on October 10th, 1980, it happened. President Jimmy Carter signed the Maine Indian Claims Settlement Act into law. The terms were historic: $81.5 million in federal funds, portions of ancestral land to be repurchased, programs for education, health, and development, legal recognition of sovereignty for the Passamaquoddy and Penobscot nations. The press called it a windfall, but the elders called it a beginning, because no amount of money could return the bones buried under highways. No law could undo the centuries of silence. But this was proof that they had never vanished, that the treaties were not forgotten, that a whisper carried long enough can become thunder. In Indian Township, the community gathered around fire pits that night, not to celebrate, but to remember. Old songs were sung. Children passed tobacco from hand to hand. Elders looked into the smoke and saw faces of those who had not lived to see the day, those who had held the line in the darkest hours. A man named Joseph Nicholas, who had fought for tribal rights since the 1940s, stood in front of the crowd and said, "They told us the law was not ours, but we showed them memory is stronger than paper." The money from the settlement was not a blank check. It came with restrictions, trust arrangements, complications. But for the first time in generations, the tribes had resources, and more importantly, the power to decide how to use them. They built schools, health clinics, language programs. Roads were paved not by outsiders, but by tribal crews. Children learned Passamaquoddy words alongside English. Grandparents taught traditional fishing techniques in classrooms. The economy, while still fragile, began to breathe. But more than infrastructure, the settlement gave the people something else, something intangible, something sacred, proof that they had been right to remember, that they had been right to fight, that even after centuries of being told they didn't matter, they did. The case became a blueprint for other tribes across the country. Lawyers studied it, activists cited it. The Passamaquoddy and Penobscot had cracked the walls of legal amnesia and let in the light. And yet, even as the nation applauded, the people knew the work was not done. Because land is more than title, justice is more than checks, and memory does not rest. It moves, like fog off the bay. It waits, like the bones beneath the pine. And sometimes when the wind is just right, it speaks. Not in anger, not in pride, but in truth. The kind of truth that survives not because it is shouted, but because it is carried. Carried by generations, carried by those who walk the shoreline with cedar in their hands and sovereignty in their hearts. This was not the end of the story. It was the moment the world realized it had never really known how it began. The Passamaquoddy word for language is Timucua, and it means far more than speech. It means breath that carries meaning. It means memory formed in sound. It means the world described as only your people can see it. But by the early 2000s, that word, along with thousands like it, was spoken fluently by fewer than 500 people. Most were elders, some were too old to hold a pen. Many had been punished in childhood for using it at all. The Passamaquoddy language stood on a knife's edge, one funeral away from silence. In Indian Township, a woman named Teresa Dana sat with her grandson on a pine floor, holding a basket of flashcards. The boy was 6, impatient, distracted by a nearby dog. She held up the card. Moskis. "Say it," she said gently. "Moskis," she smiled. "Close. Again." He tried, again and again. In that tiny room with a fire crackling low in the corner, survival was taking place. Not of body, but of soul. Because for the Passamaquoddy, language is not just a tool, it's a way of being. Every syllable carries ancestry. Every inflection carries location. There are words for snow that mean the one that listens. Words for rivers that mean the one who sings while moving. There is no single word for ownership, but many for kinship. To lose the language would be to lose a way of seeing the world entirely. And so, at the edge of cultural extinction, the people pushed back. In the early 2000s, a group of elders and linguists began gathering in a modest building at Pleasant Point. Their mission was impossible in scale: preserve a language that was slipping away faster than they could document it. But they did not flinch. Tape recorders were set up, notebooks filled with phonetic transcriptions. Elders spoke for hours, telling stories of long winters, medicinal plants, old jokes about clever bears and foolish raccoons. Every word mattered, even the pauses. Peter Francis, one of the project leads, once said, "We're not translating English, we're translating worldview." What they discovered was astonishing. The Passamaquoddy language held entire ecosystems in its grammar, verbs that reflected reciprocity, actions done with the world, not to it, tenses that considered not just time, but intention. There was no way to say, "I own this land," but there were 10 ways to say, "I belong to this place." But collecting the words was just the beginning. The next challenge: how to pass them on. At Indian Township School, an immersion program was born. Modeled after similar efforts by the Mohawk and Ojibwe nations, the curriculum flipped traditional education upside down. Instead of teaching English and offering language electives, the Passamaquoddy language was the classroom. Math was taught in Passamaquoddy. So was science. Children learned not just vocabulary, but grammar, songs, prayers, and jokes. Elders visited regularly, not as guests, but as professors of a knowledge system older than the state of Maine itself. A boy named Jacob, age 9, stood in front of the class one day and recited a story about a turtle and the stars, entirely in the ancestral tongue. His great-grandfather, seated in the back row, wept quietly. "I never thought I'd hear those words in a child's voice again," he said. Meanwhile, back at the Language Center, something even more radical was taking place. Digitization. With grants from the National Science Foundation and tribal leadership, the Passamaquoddy began recording hundreds of hours of oral history, encoded, archived, and uploaded. Elders like Joseph Nicholas and Molly Louie sat before microphones, recounting traditional stories and vocabulary. Some were shy, unused, to technology. Others leaned in like they were whispering to the wind. By 2015, a searchable online dictionary had been launched, pmportal.org, containing over 15,000 words, complete with audio files. It was not flashy, it did not go viral, but it became a sacred tool. A teenager in New York, disconnected from his roots, could now hear his grandmother's voice teaching him how to say, "I love you." A language teacher in Maine could pull up terms for medicinal plants before a lesson. A mother, rocking her baby, could sing an old lullaby without second-guessing the pronunciation. The Passamaquoddy language was not fully saved, but it had been caught, mid-fall, mid-silence, and held. The fight was not easy. Language revitalization meant confronting trauma. Elders wept, recalling the beatings they received in boarding schools. Others hesitated to speak at all, fearful they'd say it wrong. Years of shame had calcified into silence. Healing had to come first. So community circles were formed. Not classrooms, not lectures, just safe spaces, where stories were shared, sometimes brokenly, sometimes between long pauses. The younger generation sat quietly, absorbing more than just vocabulary. They were learning resilience, pride, the cost of forgetting, and the power of remembering. One night, during a winter gathering, an elder named Irene lit cedar and spoke to a room of 30 children. "Your ancestors are in these words," she said. "Every time you speak them, you call them home." And they did. Not just in classrooms, but in music, in murals, in social media posts with Passamaquoddy captions, on street signs in tribal land, on bumper stickers, even tattoos. Young men who had once run from their heritage now bore the names of rivers and grandmothers on their arms. Girls sang old songs while braiding each other's hair. Elders, some with failing vision, listened with quiet awe as the language they once believed doomed became an act of defiance, beauty, and rebirth. But still, the danger remains. Fluency is fragile. Fewer than 300 speakers remain today. Many are elderly. Time is cruel. The question is no longer if the language will survive. The question is, will we let it fade again? In one classroom, a girl stood before her classmates, trembling, voice cracking. She forgot a word midway through her story. Silence fell. Her teacher, also her aunt, nodded gently. "It's okay. Try again." She did. This time, she got it right. The room erupted in quiet applause. A few clapped in rhythm, the way the old songs always ended. In that moment, no court ruling, no treaty, no settlement could match the power in that child's voice. Because language, once on the brink, had spoken back. And it said, "We are still here. We remember. We belong." And for the Passamaquoddy, that has always been the beginning of every story worth telling. Beneath the silver sheen of the St. Croix River, something ancient stirs, not just the shadow of fish or the movement of tidewater, but a legacy deeper than the current. This is where the Passamaquoddy have fished since the beginning of time, where cedar canoes once slid into cold dawn light, where eel traps and spears fed generations through long winters. The river was never a border to them. It was a vein, a promise, a relative. But in the 21st century, that river is under siege, not from muskets or settler fences, but from mercury, dams, and neglect. And so the Passamaquoddy fight on. Not with flint blades or rifles, but with environmental data, tribal resolutions, and the slow, grinding labor of sovereignty in the modern age. Their warriors now wear waders and lab coats. Their battlefields are legislative hearings and state house floors. But make no mistake, the stakes are still survival. In 2013, the people of Sipayik, also known as Pleasant Point, began reporting something strange. Tap water that reeked like rotten eggs, children breaking out in mysterious rashes, boiled water advisories that stretched for weeks. The source? A 12-mile pipeline that carried drinking water from a facility in Eastport, a town governed not by the tribe, but by the state of Maine. The Passamaquoddy had no control over the water flowing into their homes, no say over the testing, no authority to shut off the contaminated supply. Their sovereignty, it seemed, stopped at the faucet. But that was about to change. A man named Hugh Akagi, a tribal council member and lifelong fisherman, stood before the tribal assembly and said simply, "If we cannot govern our water, then we do not govern ourselves." The community rallied. Environmental scientists were brought in. Tests confirmed high levels of trihalomethanes, chemical byproducts linked to cancer and kidney damage. The Eastport facility pointed fingers. The state offered band-aids. But the Passamaquoddy were done waiting. They demanded the right to build and manage their own water system, to dig wells, to monitor contamination levels, to protect their children from a system that had long treated them as an afterthought. And they weren't just demanding this for themselves. They were demanding it for the salmon. Once, the Atlantic salmon swam the St. Croix in such numbers that it turned the water silver. It was a staple food, a sacred being, a barometer of the river's health. But by the early 2000s, thanks to pollution and hydroelectric dams, the runs had collapsed. At Indian Township, tribal biologist Kelly Newell crouched beside the riverbank, eyes fixed on a shallow eddy. Her hands moved gently, lowering a mesh net into the water. Inside, wriggling and barely the size of a pinky finger, was a juvenile salmon, a survivor. "It's not just a fish," she said. "It's a treaty partner." Because the Passamaquoddy worldview doesn't place humans above nature, it places them within it. To protect the salmon is to protect the self. To restore a fish is to restore a covenant. For years, the tribe had fought to have fish ladders installed at Grand Falls Dam. They'd reintroduced hatchery-bred salmon. They'd pulled data, drafted proposals, testified in Congress. And slowly, like the fish themselves, progress returned. In 2018, for the first time in nearly 4 decades, salmon were again seen spawning upstream of Woodland Dam. The news was quiet, no headlines. But for the Passamaquoddy, it was a ceremony, a pulse of ancestral memory returning to life. But not everyone welcomed the tribe's involvement. Maine's state government, in many ways, continued to treat tribal nations as municipalities, not sovereign entities. Their environmental agencies frequently overruled tribal concerns. Water management plans were delayed. Tribal lands were excluded from certain state cleanup efforts. Federal funding was inconsistent at best. So, the Passamaquoddy began pushing for a solution older than the Constitution: recognition. In 2022, they launched a campaign to amend the Maine Indian Claims Settlement Act, the very legislation that had provided them funding decades earlier, but had also placed limits on their autonomy. The goal was simple: to be treated like every other federally recognized tribe in the United States, with full jurisdiction over their lands, waters, and environmental policies. The opposition was swift. Some lawmakers feared tribal taxation rights. Others balked at what they saw as a special status. But behind every argument was the same quiet fear: that a people long silenced might finally speak with power again. In Augusta, a Passamaquoddy elder named Mary Thomas stood before the state and local government committee. Her voice was weathered, but unwavering. "Our water is not yours," she said. "It runs through our stories, our veins, our burial grounds. It is not property, it is kin." The room fell silent. In Washington, tribal leaders met with senators and policymakers, pressing their case with clarity and purpose. They weren't asking for favors. They were demanding the rights already owed to them by federal law. By 2023, cracks began to appear in the opposition. A bipartisan bill passed granting the Passamaquoddy limited authority over their own water systems, a hard-won step in a much longer journey. Wells were drilled, contaminated pipes were replaced, water testing began under tribal supervision. The children drank clean again. But the fight for environmental justice was far from over. At the edge of tribal land, industrial logging continued to scar ancient forests. In nearby lakes, invasive species spread faster than local mitigation efforts. Climate change threatened the seasonal cycles that had guided the people for millennia. The migration of birds, the timing of shellfish spawning, the freeze and thaw of hunting grounds. And yet, the Passamaquoddy endure. They plant sweetgrass along wetland margins. They teach teenagers how to track water quality with digital sensors and cedar sticks. They fish at night under moonlight, whispering old prayers to the wind. Their sovereignty is not measured by the approval of outsiders. It is measured in stewardship. In one community gathering, a young boy stood and asked the council, "When I grow up, will I be allowed to protect the river too?" An elder looked at him and replied, "You already are." Because the fight is no longer about reclaiming what was taken. It is about defending what still remains. It is not about history alone, but about tomorrow. The Passamaquoddy have always been warriors of the water, not because they claimed it, but because they listened to it. Not because they owned it, but because they served it. And as long as the rivers flow, as long as the tides rise and fall, as long as children ask questions about fish and fire and fog, this fight will continue, quietly, steadily, like water through granite. A sovereignty not of flags, but of flow, not of borders, but of belonging. And it begins, always, with the land and with the river that remembers. Along the ragged shoreline where Maine kisses the Bay of Fundy, the tide speaks with a rhythm older than any clock. It moves in and out like breath, 20-foot swells swallowing rocky coves, then vanishing again as if pulled by memory itself. This is where the world begins and ends each day, where light breaks first in all of North America, where the Passamaquoddy, the people of the dawn, were born. For centuries, their name was whispered only in the shadows of textbooks, tucked between the footnotes of someone else's history. A tribe known more by the treaties broken against them than by the truths they carried. But the story never ended in silence, because tides, like people, return. In a classroom not far from the river, the sound of children laughing carries through cedar walls. Inside, the desks are small, but the work is immense, rebuilding a world in syllables and songs. On the chalkboard is a word written in looping characters, Motwalon, he or she who has spiritual power. A girl, no more than 8, reads it aloud. Her voice is soft, but steady. She doesn't know it yet, but she is fulfilling a prophecy. Beside her, an elder named Clara Mosson kneels with a bundle of reeds, showing the class how to begin a basket. Not with hands, but with a prayer. You don't make a basket, she says. You listen to it. Outside, the wind carries the scent of sea salt and wet pine. A canoe rests on the shore, its birch bark skin gleaming in the morning sun. It is not a replica. It is not for tourists. It was built by hand, the old way, with spruce roots, with stone scrapers, with stories. A boy dips his fingers in the cold water, then helps his grandfather lift the canoe into the tide. It floats, not just in water, but in legacy. This is not about mere reenactment. This is resurgence. The modern Passamaquoddy live in 2 main communities, Indian Township and Sipayik, or Pleasant Point. But their spirit ranges far wider. It pulses in cultural revival programs, in environmental activism, in art, in song, in courtrooms, in kitchens, in the glint of obsidian arrowheads pulled from ancestral soil. It echoes in the ceremonial drumbeat that still rises from gatherings, the circle always welcoming, always turning. At the Tribal Museum, a young mother walks her child past exhibits filled with centuries-old snowshoes and ash baskets. Her fingers brush over the caption in both English and Passamaquoddy. She kneels and whispers the old names into her son's ear. He repeats them, stumbling over consonants his mouth doesn't yet know how to form. But he tries, and she smiles. That is enough. In another room, men and women gather over blueprints and zoning maps. This is the Tribal Council, debating water rights, broadband access, education initiatives. Their decisions may be modern, but their roots run deep. I don't want to just preserve the culture, Councilwoman Joanne Bear once said. I want our grandchildren to live in it. The line between ancient and modern here has always been blurred. On any given day, you might see a tribal member carry a smartphone in one hand and a basket of sweetgrass in the other, or wear jeans beneath a deer-hide sash, or fix a cracked truck engine after teaching a language class. This is what survival looks like when it matures into sovereignty. But make no mistake, resilience is not romance. The challenges remain sharp. Poverty rates are still high. Access to healthcare is limited. Substance abuse lingers like a ghost at the edge of the fire. Climate change threatens the fragile ecosystems that once sustained the tribe in balance. Warming waters, shifting migrations, and storm surges eating away at sacred coastlines. Yet amid these challenges, something remarkable is unfolding. Young people, who once felt ashamed to speak their language in public, are now reclaiming it in music, poetry, and podcasts. The tribal schools have incorporated curriculum that fuses Western science with traditional ecological knowledge. Students learn about astronomy while hearing creation stories. They study marine biology and also learn how to harvest clams without angering the tides. Old dances are being revived, not for performance, but for communion, and everywhere. The tide of forgetting is beginning to recede. At a recent dawn gathering, just before the solstice, tribal members stood barefoot in the dewy grass, watching the first light crest over the Atlantic. A line of children held handmade torches. Elders sang a welcome song, the same one their ancestors sang when the French first arrived, before betrayal, before war, before borders carved their homeland into pieces. The flame passed from child to child, and with it, something invisible, but enduring, responsibility. This is what the documentary comes back to, like a tide returning home. Not the pain of loss alone, but the pain transformed. Not the image of a people frozen in the past, but a people in motion. The canoe gliding, the voice singing, the hand building, the land healing, the school rising, the tide turning. One woman, a midwife and language instructor, summed it up best. "We are not what was taken from us," she said. "We are what we kept alive, what we're still bringing into the world." And so the film closes not with an ending, but with a continuation. The camera pans out over the Bay of Fundy, the water shifting in massive, slow waves. The sun breaks the horizon like it always has. It casts a golden glow over spruce trees and wind-worn rocks, over fishing boats and berry thickets and smoke from cooking fires. The tide is rising, and with it, the people of the dawn, not victims, not relics, but survivors, storytellers, builders, stewards, children of the light returning, the Passamaquoddy, still here, still rising, like the tide.